happen, please don't hesitate to be patient, and I'll log back in and we'll pick up where we left off. But this training is on the road to trauma-informed care. This is just a little bit about me. Many of you know that I was at Governor State for 10 years and 7 months. I miss you guys, the best group of people you can teach, even though there's some of you I have never met before. I know that you are great students because Governor State takes the best of the best. So I know that to be a fact. So this is some of our training objectives. Is you will be able to define trauma, trauma-informed care, and complex trauma, which is a lot of people in the trauma area is now talking about is complex trauma. You will learn a difference between trauma-specific and trauma-informed, learn key principles to trauma-informed care and direct practice, and the tenets of trauma-informed care and its importance to the practice, and recognize the importance of trauma-informed care in practice. So one of the things that I want to do is give you some...
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Are we supposed to be seeing your screen right now?
Yes, are you not seeing my screen?
No, we cannot see your screen.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We see your face. Thank you, whoever did that.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can see it now. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yes, all right, so let's start back at those objectives I was going over. And the last thing you will get from this training is recognize the importance of trauma-informed practices. So to help you with your practice, if any of you are planning on opening a clinic or doing anything like that, this will definitely help you in that process. So I would like to give this trauma warning is that we will be looking at videos depict sensitive and adult content such as violence, sexual assault, abuse, and other traumatic events. So please let me know if you have any concerns, but most important is you find that it's difficult, just go ahead and shut your video down and just wait and come back. So it's designed to educate professionals about trauma-exposed population, and is not intended to be a form of treatment for people experiencing psychiatric distress.
Okay. No.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I had heard something, so I wasn't sure if somebody needed something. So some of the videos I'll show are for strictly educational purposes. Okay, the opinions are expressed by the presenter or the instructor are not intended to diagnose, condemn anyone shown in the videos. And I'm not going to be showing anything of actual clients, so you don't have to worry about that. And so the last is housekeeping. The training is 4 hours. Breaks will be 5 minutes throughout the training. Feel free to take a break as needed. Lunch is a working lunch, so we will give you 10 minutes to grab your lunch, and then we'll continue with training. I encourage you to show yourselves, and CEUs are for individuals with a license, not students. And write this down real quick. To obtain CEUs, you have to email Dr. Shannon Dermer, the Dean of the College of Education, and that's sdermer@govstate.edu. And then you will complete a survey to obtain your CEUs. Please ask questions throughout the training. Like if you need to, tap in, just say, hey, could you explain this? Give us more on that. Don't hesitate to ask. So for you, those of you, what is trauma? How would you define it? Anybody can speak up. What is trauma? Anybody?
Hi,
And-
this is Jay
and-
Latrice. So trauma is like an emotional response to a really bad event like Hurricane Katrina, rape, things like that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So what is trauma? It's kind of any event that involves exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. It has the potential to be traumatic. Almost everyone who experienced trauma will be emotionally affected, but not everyone will respond into the same way. So most people will recover within the first week or two with the help of family and friends. For some, it will be last longing.
You want to come hang out?
So how would you define PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder?
Hi, Shay. Terry D'Amico here.
Hi, D'Amico, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well.
So anyway, PTSD is trauma responses that last more than 6 months after the trauma
Absolutely.
and tend to intensify over time.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Terry. So what Terry said, I want to add is a set of reactions that can develop after someone has been through a traumatic event. A person with PTSD have 4 main difficulties. They relive the traumatic event. They feel wind up, like having trouble sleeping or concentrating, feeling angry or irritable, taking tasks, become easily startled, or, that feeling wind up is kind of like that, hyper vigilant. They avoid reminders of the event and negative thoughts and feelings. So they'll feel afraid, angry, guilty. Some of the things, they're feeling cut off from their friends and family. So those are some of the things that a person with PTS, those main types of difficulties they're experiencing. So does anybody know what is complex post-traumatic stress disorder? This is kind of new, so if you don't know, that's fine, because it's something that is kind of started in the field. It is not a DSM-5 diagnosis, which a lot of people are pushing for. So complex PTSD is caused by long-lasting trauma that continues or repeat for months, even years, commonly referred to as complex trauma. When it comes to complex trauma, the human effects of oppression and racism can add layers to complex trauma experienced by individuals. This is further compounding of the justice system that is involved. As a result, some people are given the diagnosis of bipolar disorder or another personality disorder, and we're going to look at how they differ. So what causes complex PTSD is childhood abuse or neglect. You may see ongoing domestic violence, repeatedly witnessed violence or abuse. You will often see like a lot of children come in with complex PTSD, being forced or manipulated to prostitution. One of the things is that we're seeing is a lot of people with complex PTSD are involved in human trafficking, people who experience torture, kidnapping, or slavery, or being a prisoner of war. The young lady, I can't remember her name, I think it's Elizabeth Smart, who was abducted. She experiences complex PTSD. So you're more likely to develop complex PTSD if you experience trauma at an early age. Remember, I mentioned children. The trauma lasted for a long period of time. So they're saying like it's a continuous thing. escape or rescue were unlikely or impossible. Go back to the Elizabeth Smart case. You experienced multiple traumas and you have been harmed by someone close to you. So some of the symptoms that we look at is lack of emotional regulations, okay? They have this issue with controlling anger. They may have ongoing sadness. Most likely the emotional regulation you will see is more of that explosive anger, very much so. And that's why they talk about it's connected to bipolar disorder, changes in consciousness, okay? They can forget the trauma event or feeling detached from emotions in the body, which is also called disassociation. So let me tell you, I have this client who comes in, and it was really interesting is that he had two uncles. One uncle he remembered very fondly, and the other uncle he couldn't remember at all. And I kept saying, there's a piece missing here. Because the second uncle, at his funeral, his children were really upset because they said, you were really close to my dad. Our dad raised you. And when he came to session, he said, I don't understand that because I don't really remember him. And so when we started to process, that's where he kind of lost that change in consciousness. He had blocked that off because the uncle was very abusive. So he didn't even remember and to come into session, and some of those things open up. They also have a negative self-perception. They feel guilt or shame to the point that they feel completely different from other people. Difficulty relationships, again, that's where that kind of that bipolar diagnosis can come in. They avoid relationships. Some might seek relationship with people who harm them because it seems familiar. So you're like working with a client, it's like, well, you've experienced this through your life. Well, then why would you choose somebody that is very similar to what you know? And it is because it's familiar, right? They don't know. It goes back to that negative self-perception. Distorted perception of their abuser. It can include perception with revenge or giving your abuser complete power over your life. Loss of systems of meaning. So when we look at PTSD and complex PTSD symptoms, so when we look over to the side with PTSD on your, I think it's your left, the sense of threat, avoidance, and re-experiencing. So complex PTSD have those same symptoms, but they have interpersonal disturbances, negative self-concept, and affect regulation. So what does trauma-informed care and CPTSD, looking at the level of the individual practitioner, the following principles should guide care. So you want to promote safety, and that's very similar to what you would do with PTSD, right? Promote hope and recovery. So you'll talk about, you don't have to get stuck here. You can move up to a different place where you're not so triggered by these things. You promote calm. So some people may use mindfulness. Promote connectedness, but healthy connectedness, right? So when we look at their relationships, we may challenge them in terms of, okay, is this connection going to heighten your symptoms or heighten your inability to connect with people that are, appropriate? Then we focus on strengths and resources. So the key here is to look at, I always say, one of the biggest ways to promote strength, the first thing you can start off with is, wow, you're resilient. You have been through a lot and you're still here. You're still trying to get through and navigate this. So I always use a strength is resilience. And then we need to focus on our own self-care, right? So we want to look at that we don't get traumatized from their trauma. So we want to always be involved in processes that keep us healthy, such as, having supervision, having support groups amongst your colleagues. So you can focus on when you seem to have some of the vicarious symptoms of trauma. So now we're going to look at 2 videos. What is Cptsd and how is it different from PTSD? And then we're going to look at borderline personality disorder, because I've been mentioning it a lot, and Cptsd, right? We're going to look at them to see how we can spot the difference. Because what PTSD, there's a typical one traumatic event that an individual is dealing with. However, complex PTSD is a diagnosis that occurs when a person experiences repeated episodes of trauma. You can see complex post-traumatic stress disorder also in domestic violence situations. The individual has experienced several traumatic events that have happened over the years. The symptoms can be more severe than someone who has PTSD. So the reason for this is that their trauma is repeated and prolonged. A person who has complex PTSD may cope with childhood abuse or repeated incidents of trauma, where they begin to be distrusting of other people. People who have been raised in an unsafe household are likely to have complex PTSD. When a parent harms a child, they grow up being fearful that they may hurt again. So complex PTSD doesn't necessarily have to relate to child abuse, but how it can affect adults. Anyone who has experienced repeated trauma can have this diagnosis. So if you've survived the repeated traumatic incidents, you can benefit from seeking mental health treatment and things like that. So let's take a look at the first video.
What is complex PTSD or Cptsd, and how is it different from PTSD? How do we treat these problems? That's what I'm going to talk about today in this video. I'm Dr. Tracy Marks, a psychiatrist, and I publish weekly videos about mental health education and self-improvement. If you don't want to miss a video, click subscribe and the notification bell. Today's topic is inspired by a viewer question from ZT, and I'll read the question. If you don't mind, I'm curious about something. I am bipolar and getting proper care, but there's something that happened to me over the summer. My brother-in-law violated me by touching my breast and my butt on the outside of my shorts and inside of my shirt arms of a shirt. Would you please talk about how to handle this? My doctor has me on something for PTSD, and it's not helping with how to handle this once and for all. I would love to see a conversation about that, please. Thanks, ZT, for this question. I also had a question about Cptsd, so I decided to include both topics in this video. PTSD used to be considered an anxiety disorder, but with the new edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that came out in 2013, it was moved to the category of trauma and stress-related disorders. The significance of this is that PTSD is more than anxiety.
Oops, sorry. I don't know what happened.
People have very complex emotions afterwards that include guilt, shame, and anger. And those are just examples, but lots of things more than just anxiety. You can think of PTSD as an emotional reaction to a traumatic situation. The trauma is something that poses a risk to your life, physical harm, or sexual violence. And this would be something like experiencing a natural disaster, or a car accident, or being sexually assaulted, like in the case of ZT. This would not be something like being yelled at by your boss or being embarrassed in front of a group of people. Those situations, no doubt, are upsetting, but they are different in quality from the trauma of a life-threatening situation. This would also not happen from having a terminal illness like cancer, but it can happen from a medical catastrophe that's sudden and unexpected, like waking up from anesthesia in the middle of surgery. Now, this issue of qualifying trauma can make some people feel invalidated. And it's as though their traumatic experience isn't bad enough for them to get PTSD, or their experience doesn't count. And that's not really the intent of the diagnosis. The reason for excluding certain experiences as qualifying trauma for PTSD is because not all things that you experience as traumatic result in the grouping of symptoms that we call PTSD. That doesn't mean that your trauma doesn't cause you to be depressed, ruin your self-esteem, or make you have anxiety. It just means that your reaction to the trauma is different than what we see in people with PTSD from certain types of traumatic experiences. In fact, we've seen on brain scans that people with PTSD have changes in areas of their brain, like the amygdala and the hippocampus, that people without PTSD don't have. So I just want to make that clear, that saying your traumatic experience doesn't qualify for PTSD is not saying that you weren't hurt by your situation or that there's nothing wrong with you. It just means that your response to the situation is not the same as PTSD. But we do have other trauma-based disorders. So in reality, it really doesn't matter whether we technically call it PTSD or adjustment disorder with depressed mood. The more important thing is that if your symptoms are a response to trauma, that the trauma is addressed in your treatment. That's what matters. And I'll talk about the treatment later on in the video. But first, what does PTSD even look like? And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because there's a lot of symptoms of PTSD. In fact, there's 20 possible symptoms, but I will list the symptom criteria in the description for you. But the gist of it is you have 4 groups of symptoms: intrusion symptoms, where memories of the event just pop into your mind at times that you don't want it to. And this can be nightmares, or it can be thoughts that happen during the day. There's avoidance symptoms of things that remind you of the trauma. Someone who had a bad car accident may never want to drive again or even get into a car again. Then there's negative thoughts or moods associated with the trauma. An example of this would be someone who feels like they just don't think that they're going to live very long. They don't necessarily know why, that's just the feeling that they have. Or they have the constant thought that something else bad is going to happen. The 4th group of symptoms involve being on edge or hyperreactive. And this is where you can get the anger outbursts, or the person can have trouble sleeping because they're checking locks in the middle of the night. To have PTSD, you need 1 or 2 symptoms from all 4 groups occurring at the same time. So this is what I mean by PTSD being a very specific type of disorder that results from a specific kind of traumatic experience. So what's complex PTSD or Cptsd? Complex PTSD is not an official diagnosis in our diagnostic manual. Instead, we call it a construct, or a term used to describe a different kind of experience that a person has from chronic traumatic experiences that occur over time. It's usually trauma that starts in childhood, and this could be either physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. It can even result from neglect. And because the neglect or abuse is occurring during the extremely vulnerable developmental years, the trauma shapes your development and your personality. It's like you have a fractured self, and people suffering from this can spend years trying to mend the fracture. So unlike a person with PTSD, who may be checking locks and having flashbacks and refusing to drive or jumping every time they hear a loud noise, with Cptsd, you see more behavioral things like relationship difficulties, poor self-esteem, anger problems, mood instability. The person with Cptsd can develop a depression or anxiety secondary to these problems, but at the core is the issue of this fractured self that came from a serious emotional disruption during the formative years. So the baggage from all of that trauma ends up being hardwired into you, And this hardwiring affects how you respond to the world. Now, the person with PTSD can also see some shifts in their personality, not to the same degree as the person with CPTSD. You can become more negative, not necessarily all the way depressed, but have this lingering negativity about your future. You can also feel as though you have memory problems, be a lot more irritable all the time, have a lot of shame, even anxiety and sleep problems. And the person with PTSD can also become depressed on top of that. So how do we treat the trauma-based disorders? If you have a significant depression or anxiety symptoms, those can be treated with medication. But really getting at the root of the trauma requires psychotherapy. And not everyone needs medication. If you need medication, though, think of it as something that dampens your symptoms that are causing all this disruption to your life, just to make it easier for you to work through the trauma experience. A very good, strongly recommended treatment for trauma is EMDR, and that stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This involves discussing the experience while engaging in the exercise of moving your eyes back and forth. The process of crossing the midline of your brain, going side to side, helps your brain reprocess how you respond emotionally to the trauma. That's a very simplified explanation of that therapy. If you are avoiding things like avoiding having sex because you were raped, a therapist can use different forms of exposure therapy to help you reconnect to the thing that you're avoiding. There's other kinds of trauma-based therapy, such as cognitive processing therapy, which is very popular in the Veterans Administration, and they use it with veterans with PTSD. There's also brain remapping and other somatic therapies. Dialectical behavior therapy, which was developed for borderline personality disorder, can be a form of trauma-based therapy because borderline personality disorder is thought to have its roots in childhood trauma. So, and I'll have a link to that video where I discuss borderline personality disorder. So if you have complex PTSD, DBT may be very helpful for you, even if you haven't been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. I hope this helps you understand the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD, as well as answering your question, ZT, on how do you get past the trauma and what are the ways that, or the therapies that can be used to help with that. It's not going to be just medication. Leave me a comment to let me know your thoughts.
Okay, so that's the video on CPTSD and post-traumatic stress disorder and how you can tell the difference. Next, we're going to talk about, because I've talked about it in several of the slides, about borderline personality disorder and CPTSD and how you can spot the difference.
About this, and if you have any experience with
Watch this full series at the links in the description below and subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch new mental health videos every week. Hi YouTube, it's Kyle Kelson here with Dr. Ramani. Thanks for being here. Now, so many of our members have written, emailed, found us on Instagram and said, where's the series on complex post-traumatic stress disorder? And that's what we just filmed.
Yeah.
Many of you have heard about PTSD. Most people have, but not as many understand or even know about complex PTSD. And here to talk about what that is and then give us the difference between that and borderline personality disorder, Dr. Ramani, what is complex PTSD?
So CPTSD is a sort of almost like a subset of post-traumatic stress disorder, but it looks a little different. And it's a result of somebody who's experienced long-term exposure to trauma. Usually where we see it is somebody who's experienced long-term child physical abuse or child sexual abuse, long-term domestic violence or intimate partner violence, or people in other settings like people who are victims or survivors of human trafficking or refugees, people who were in long-term traumatic situations from which escape was nearly impossible or would be dangerous for the child, a person stuck in an abusive intimate partnership, that sort of thing. So that inescapability and the chronic nature of it makes it a little different than that episodic exposure you would have typically seen in post-traumatic stress disorder. So it feels a little different. What we see in complex PTSD is we see that there are issues around emotional dysregulation, lots of difficulties in interpersonal relationships, including excessive reactivity, reacting with strong shows of anger or fear of interpersonal relationships. There's a shift in the perception of the self. People who experience complex PTSD will often view themselves very negatively, as damaged, as shameful, sometimes even taking blame for what happened to them or believing that somehow they might have deserved this. And they may even have a skewed perception of their perpetrator and viewing them as sometimes all powerful, and then at times even harboring fantasies of revenge against them. They'll have difficulties with attention and concentration. In some people with complex PTSD, you may even occasionally see sort of a dissociative quality where they sort of seem to go away for a minute, but there's also disruptions in being able to pay attention and being able to concentrate, which can make it difficult to engage with other people. So it feels different than the classical presentation we see in traditional post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a very fear-based disorder. And there's lots of anxiety arousal, hypervigilance, being on edge, having exaggerated response in the face of something that's startling, lots of avoidance. So while there's a tremendous amount of overlap between traditional PTSD and complex PTSD, some of the issues around dysregulation and the relationship issues that arise definitely veer away from what we traditionally see in PTSD.
Excellent. I want to poll our audience. When was the first time you heard the term complex PTSD? Was it right now in this video, or have you heard about it years and years ago? Let us know in the comments section below. Now, because of some of these traits that Cptsd has, it often gets confused as borderline personality disorder. So how can we tell the difference between those two?
There's a tremendous overlap between complex PTSD and borderline personality, and that's something the field struggles with. There are some key differences though. Despite the kinds of relationship struggles people with complex PTSD have, and even sort of the strong reactivity that people have in complex PTSD, the flare-ups of anger and those kinds of reactions, one thing you don't see in complex PTSD are the chronic abandonment struggles. There's not a fear of abandonment. It's much more, if anything, there's a fear of the relationship itself, like relationships don't feel like safe spaces. People with borderline personality have a very, very unstable sense of identity. It's almost like at times they don't know who they are.
Right.
Whereas in a person with complex PTSD, they have a distorted sense of themselves. So they view themselves as damaged or shameful. But it's not like they simply say, I don't know who I am. Does that make sense? It's very different. And then the third thing we see is, in some ways, it's a severity issue. Borderline personality disorder, something we've talked about on Med Circle before, is the mental illness with the highest rate of suicide, making it one of the most dangerous and distressing mental illnesses we talk about. So these suicidal crises, the self-harming gestures, you don't really see that in complex PTSD. So while there may be some risk because of the level of distress, it's definitely not part of the classical picture of complex PTSD. And so in that way, borderline personality, some have suggested, is definitely a more severe pattern, and that whether it's not considered a variant though, because there are enough differences. We also know that something both have in common, complex PTSD and borderline personality, is that very commonly people with borderline personality have experienced early trauma, but not all have. So not every single person out in the world with borderline personality has a history of significant childhood trauma.
Right.
Whereas in complex PTSD, that's far, far, far more normative. And in a person with complex PTSD, there's been at least one period of life where they've experienced long-term chronic, relatively inescapable trauma.
Right.
So right now we grapple with how much overlap there is, and although there's quite a bit, there's something about the abandonment issues, how identity and self are viewed, and the severity of some of the behaviors such as suicidal crises and suicidal behavior that definitely differentiate borderline personality from complex PTSD.
Yes, understanding borderline personality disorder gives me a better understanding of complex PTSD.
Yes.
And our viewers can learn about the 9 traits of borderline personality disorder by clicking the card that just popped up on this video, or you can use the links in the video description below. Because the series is so great, I want to give all of these viewers watching an inside look into the series by MedCircle on complex PTSD. Here's a sneak peek.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask this question and I want you guys to tell me, what do you think? Is this complex PTSD? Is this post-traumatic stress disorder? Or is this borderline? Which one will likely get this diagnosis? People who have been raised in a safe household are likely to have what? Are they likely to have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or be borderline, diagnosed with borderline personality disorder? So what do you guys think? People who have been raised in an unsafe household are likely to have what?
Unsafe, can you?
PTSD.
We got one PTSD. What you got, Patience? What you say?
I was trying to, you said unsafe household, correct?
Right, an unsafe household. What would they have? Complex traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder?
I don't know, I guess you have to define what the unsafe household, I would say PTSD.
Okay, so we
Complex
got,
PTSD.
okay, so we got two.
Complex.
Okay, we got three.
Complex. People are writing it in their in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry, complex. So we got a lot of complex. Let me look, because let's see what we got here. Complex. So Alicia, I hope I'm saying your name right. Alicia writes complex PTSD because of being in the household for years, and some things are being relived over time. So she said complex PTSD because of being in the household for years, and some things are being relived over time. So if you said complex PTSD, you're right. So good job, everybody.
Dr. Dunham, I have a question. This is Latrice again. Will this recording be made available to us?
You know what? I'm not sure.
Yes.
I think, oh yes, it will be.
Yes, it
Okay.
will be. It'll be emailed out to you guys as a YouTube link
Okay.
after the fact. So probably Monday or Tuesday, I'll get that sent out to you guys.
Okay, thank you so much.
Well-
Latrice, don't leave me though. Don't leave me, Latrice.
Oh, no, I'm not going anywhere. I'm just trying to take notes, and the videos are going so fast, I couldn't get my notes together. I'm like, oh no. No, I'm not
Okay,
going
well,
anywhere. Trust me.
all right, stay with me. Stay with me.
Okay.
So yes, if those of you who said that when a parent harms a child, they grow up being fearful, they're likely to have complex PTSD. One of the things that you will see in clients is that they are fearful that they may be hurt again. So you may see that a lot. So I have a client who was in a relationship. They were in couples counseling, and she could not emotionally regulate. And we looked and we traced it to, she had a long history of an unsafe household where things were just not predictable, right? So that made things very unsafe. And when I mean unpredictable, she was actually having some physical abuse, some sexual abuse on an uncontinuous basis. So the next thing I want you to look at is the three major things people get wrong about trauma.
Hi YouTube, Kyle Kittleson here with MedCircle, joined by the fantastic clinical psychologist, Dr. Romney. We just filmed a series on trauma, and you were sharing some misconceptions around trauma that are really pervasive. And I'd be curious to hear what all of our viewers think of other misconceptions about trauma that you've experienced or you've seen firsthand. So after you hear Dr. Romney's three, leave ones that we could have missed out in the comments section below. So Dr. Romney, what is the first misconception when it comes to trauma?
I would say it's the overuse of the term trauma to describe things that don't really fall under that definition, which really is trauma is an experience that is far beyond that which is considered normal human experience, and during which a person feels a significant risk or experience of bodily threat or death. So that's way beyond, you know, for example, people will say, I had to wait 2 hours in line at the airport. I have trauma.
Yeah.
Not unless you saw someone get shot in that line. You know, I mean, an inconvenience, a difficulty, that's not a trauma. And to call these sorts of everyday occurrences, or maybe even not everyday, but major inconveniences, a trauma, is to minimize and trivialize the experience of people who are living with trauma and whose lives and psyches are turned upside down by trauma. And I think we just need to watch that overuse of that term, because again, it really misses the boat on how much trauma psychologically affects people and actually can hurt them as they go through their experience, thinking like, well, maybe I'm over exaggerating and minimizing that experience. So just really I tell people, be careful, and we need to be aware of that when we use that term. What does it really mean? Because it means something very specific in the world of mental health.
Yeah, your favorite cafe running out of avocado toast is not a traumatic event. And we do this with so many mental health terms. Oh, that's so OCD, or I'm so OCD, or I have PTSD, and likely they don't, but they're using the term incorrectly. So all of us need to do a better job at doing that. So let's move on to our second misconception.
You can always tell that somebody's experienced a trauma by looking at them.
Oh, right.
So I can tell if someone's been through trauma. I can just look in their eyes. No, you can't. You would be shocked by the number of people you may have in your life, that you've encountered, that you work with, even amongst your friends, that have experienced a very real and frank trauma that maybe they've processed, and you know that they feel they understand. They may not want to talk about it, that they don't want to talk about it, that they haven't shared it. But it is more common than you might think, and you can't tell just by looking at someone. And that is because when people go through trauma, while there are some universals in how people present, that can vary depending on how soon after the trauma it is, the nature of it, how many years down the road, depending on a person's age. All of those things may matter in terms of the experience of how someone will express a trauma. But we can't tell if someone's been through trauma just by looking at them. You know, again, estimates vary widely in terms of how many people experience trauma. We have better statistics on how many people experience post-traumatic stress disorder. It's probably about, maybe 20% plus or minus of people who have experienced a significant trauma go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, but that varies based on the nature of the trauma. Those rates are going to be higher, for example, for someone who's experienced rape or sexual assault. It may be lower for other kinds of traumatic events. So that also is going to vary quite a bit. So I think that what we have to keep in mind is that there is no universal. There's trends, things like hypervigilance, hyperarousal, anxiety, sense of a foreshortened future, re-experiencing, depression, social withdrawal. Those are things we do tend to see in people with trauma, but it's not always the same. It's not always on the same time frame. But no, you can't tell by looking at someone. And so when you meet a person, that's not something you can just say, I figured this out. Or even worse, to meet someone and say, they're so well put together. There's no way they could have experienced a trauma. I cannot think of anything further from the truth. A person experiencing trauma does not mean that they're forever set back and can't go on to a full and extraordinarily successful life. But that idea that if he or she is well put together, they could not have been through trauma, is something that often hurts people. They're saying, well, maybe that bad thing didn't happen to them because they're doing so well. To which I say, how dare you?
Absolutely.
How dare you ever make an assumption about somebody else's?
And in our series, the idea of resilience came up, and you said something that made me hit the edge of my chair. Let's give our viewers an inside look at this part from our series on trauma.
Resilience is the belief and then the execution of being able to survive in the face of a crisis, potentially a trauma. Here's where I want to tread lightly, because there are people out there who struggle with trauma. That doesn't mean they're not resilient.
Ooh, good point.
And I don't want anyone out there who's a trauma survivor saying, I'm folding under this, I must not be resilient. The heck you're not.
Yeah.
You are resilient.
Yeah.
You have been pushed beyond the normal bounds of human experience. None of us know how we're going to react to a trauma until we're in it.
That's right. You can watch that entire series at medcircle.com, or just use the links below this video. Let's move on to our third one up front.
that trauma is only defined by something happening directly to you, that you have to be assaulted. You are the one who's raped. You are the one who's kidnapped. It has to happen to you. In fact, trauma can also be defined by witnessing something happening, like a crime, assault, murder of someone close to you, a loved one, or someone close to you. To witness that that qualifies as a trauma. And people say, well, that didn't happen to her. How could you say that's a trauma? And we can see that, for example, after natural disasters, people can experience post-traumatic stress disorder, post-traumatic stress, and that qualifies as a trauma because they've gone through, perhaps if not watching their own home wash away, think of a tornado, which can selectively go down one side of the street, but not another. Watching your best friend's home, your longstanding neighbor's home, just, be swept away, that's a trauma. Because also that thing was across the street. It could have also harmed you, may very well have harmed those people close to you. So it doesn't have to happen to you. It can be about witnessing, because what some people will feel is like, what right do I have to feel trauma? I didn't go through this. I'm being ridiculous. I must be weak. How dare I say I have trauma? It's survivor guilt. Exactly. So it's that idea that, yes, if it happens to you, if somebody watches harm come to their child, to their partner, or even to a friend or neighbor, that does qualify. And what that means, though, is that to be aware that does qualify as a trauma. The person may be experiencing it as a trauma, and that definitely means that they need to seek out appropriate mental health services.
Yes. Well, this series walks you through the sign.
So one of the things that really stood out to me is kind of that trauma that you get when it doesn't happen to you. So I had a client come in, and she was from California, and the fires in California came about 2 blocks from her house. And she was also watching the fires on TV constantly, because she was really worried about that happening to her. So she ended up developing a trauma as a result of, fearing that the fires was going to reach her house. Was, like I said, it was only 2 blocks away, but also constantly watching it on the news. And the connection between that, because I'm sure of you saying, well, we watch violence and stuff like that, is that it was connected to her because of the fires that was 2 blocks away. So she saw it happening to her, even though it didn't happen to her. So understanding the basics of trauma-informed care. So when we understand the basis of trauma-informed care, we look at how it impacts the system. We look at how it impacts the individual. And understanding trauma-informed care, we understand that it's much bigger than the individual. It takes a bigger place in understanding how it resonates within systems, within individuals, within society. So that's why it's very important to understand trauma-informed care. So let's look at it a little bit in depth, okay? So when we look at trauma-informed care, it refers to a shift in perspective on the part of the professional that recognize that complex and cumulative trauma is most often the cause of many forms of mental distress. So research says in the United States, the lifetime prevalence rate of exposure to a traumatic event has been estimated between 50 to 70% of the general population and 90% of public mental health population. So trauma-informed care is a strength-based framework. It is kind of grounded in the understanding of the responsiveness to the impact of trauma, right? That emphasizes physical, psychological, and emotional safety for both providers and survivors. And that it creates an opportunity for survivors to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. So that is when we look at the basis of trauma-informed care, is that we look at the survivor as a person that is, like we said before, and they said in the video, as resilient, that they're able to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. So when you think about trauma-informed services, what do you think about? What do you think about when I say, what is trauma-informed services based off, you can even use the slide before, what would it look like?
Hi, so this is Latrice. So what do you mean, like seeking counseling for it, talk therapy? Is that what you're referring to?
Like the services that our consumers may feel. So you named one, you said mental health. Anybody else? She said one, mental health.
Maybe someone who seeks services from domestic violence.
Absolutely, absolutely. Good job, you two. So trauma-informed services are those that kind of incorporate that understanding of the impact of violence and psychological trauma in the lives of the people who seek mental health services, healthcare service, and social services. So when Carla was talking, the impact of violence, and we look at how we would work with them, right? And how we see them in terms of trauma-informed care. So we would add that into what we, how we practice. So we would add trauma-informed care into how we practice. So healthcare and social service professionals who work with a trauma-informed framework, they understand traumatic experiences are not rare, right? And that they're highly prevalent in communities. You know, you look at, some of our larger cities, right? They're experiencing a high prevalent amount of trauma, especially in areas where there's a lot of violence. And so when you go into those areas to provide services, you really need to know that traumatic experiences are not rare, right? You also need to know that psychological, emotional, spiritual impact of trauma on the individual as well. So right now, I'm gonna give you about a 10-minute break because we're kind of moving pretty fast. So I'm gonna give you a 10-minute break. So come back at, let's just say, come back at 11:10. So I want you guys to come back at 11:10 because we have an activity that's gonna take a little minute.
10:10.
On our end, it's 10:10. Dr.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Thank you, Carla. So that'll be 10:10. I'm thinking about my time. I'm an hour ahead. So 10:10. Okay, Carla, you my timekeeper. So you correct me if I get that wrong. So let's come back at 10:10. But in the meantime, if anybody want to stay behind and ask questions, you can. But if anybody who want to take a break can also. Because I know I see some things in the chat that I may not be able to address because, I'm lecturing a little bit. So any questions during our break? I'm here.
Hi, Latrice again. I do have a question.
Yes,
So I'm a sexual assault advocate and domestic violence advocate for Pillars Community Health. And so I had a client who grew up in a very traumatic household, but she was seeking services for her sexual assault. Now, she was diagnosed with PTSD, but from what I've been learning thus far, it sounds like she has complex PTSD.
So she's a sexual assault victim, right?
Yes.
And was that so the way to check it out, is it is a continuous experience or was it like rape?
So her childhood, she was assaulted and she had very abusive parents in her childhood, right?
Okay.
So as an adult, she is a survivor of a sexual assault.
Okay, so that would seem like that was complex because it was continuous, right, Latrice?
Right, right.
So that would be complex versus,
Okay.
let's say, for instance, her uncle came home and raped her, right?
Mhm.
That would be more on the line of PTSD.
Okay. Got it. So she's been misdiagnosed then. So, and that's why I was asking, would this be sent to us? Because I was watching the video and I'm trying to take notes. And so I'm trying to listen while I'm taking notes. So what is the difference in the care and the treatment for PTSD and complex PTSD? Because she has been diagnosed with PTSD.
Okay, so some of the things that you would look at in complex in terms of treatment, the type of model she talked about, DBT, you can do cognitive behavioral therapy. You can even do attachment work with, you know, somebody with CPS, but a lot of is interpersonal work and emotion regulation. Remember that slide I
Right.
showed you where they
Yeah.
had the difference? So
Yeah.
those are the areas, those top 3 will be where you focus.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, Dr. Dunham. This is Sharon Holmes. I wanted to ask a question.
Sure, Sharon.
So I was listening to the complex PTSD portion, and I was wondering, I know that it's kind of compounded by several, or by ongoing trauma, but I wondered if that trauma had to be the same ongoing trauma, or could it be several different traumas that have caused the individual to re-experience it over and over. So say, for instance, rather than a person who is molested by their uncle over a period of 2 years, as opposed to a young lady who has been raped 3 times in separate occurrences.
Okay, so that would, because remember, it's the relive, so it's over a period of time. So the person who had experienced it probably 3 times, I would say they would be diagnosed more with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay, so because of the ongoing nature of the one who is experiencing it over a period of a year or whatever.
Yeah. And one thing else to look at, Sharon, it could be like, say, for instance, she was sexually assaulted, but she had added layers to that. So the person who had been sexually assaulted for 3 times, right? And we add layers to that. So say they were sexually assaulted and the person in the household was being violent, right? Being violent. You can kind of put them on that continuum of complex PTSD because they're living a experience of some type of violence on a continuous basis.
Got you. So not necessarily considering it complex PTSD based on the rape, but on the accompanying violence that they've experienced over a period of time.
Yeah, it's you bring those 2 together. So she was raped 3 times and her attacker was being threatening on a continuous basis, and or her mother was physically abusive too on a continuous basis. You can add those and look at it from a bigger picture and say there's more complex PTSD.
That makes sense. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I hope that you guys hearing about complex PTSD really start to help you look, because I know the new sexy is borderline. Everybody's borderline. Everybody's bipolar. But I hope that you can see it different now when you go to diagnose, that you can see those individuals different and not automatically, diagnose them BPD as that, but look at them from a complex trauma experience.
I agree. And I think that's so important, especially considering the landscape of our society right now. And that a lot of us do work in the inner city where we'll see complex trauma pop up, maybe even a little bit more based on some of the violence and losses that our young people are experiencing.
Right, absolutely, absolutely, right. Like if you know, I think about you know, like say for instance, if I shot somebody, right, that would be PTSD versus if somebody living in the hood, right, and they see continuous violence, that would be you know, complex PTSD. And like I said, the eye-opening for me, Sharon, is when I really got an understanding of the emotional regulation in terms of complex PTSD. It really kind of shifted because we see in BPD that we see that level of emotional regulation, but when complex PTSD, it's a little bit more in depth. So I would see in complex PTSD a lot of reactive anger.
Mm-hmm.
So I would see more reactive anger.
Okay. And then also too, I wonder what you think about this. That a lot of times I've noticed from the clients that I deal with that if they've been, you know, admitted to inpatient, a lot of them will come out with the BPD diagnosis. And when you start seeing them, you realize it's a lot more complicated than that. Is that kind of along the lines of what you're referring to?
Yeah, you know, you see that because of the simple fact that complex PTSD really hasn't been recognized as a diagnosis. So you may see that diagnosis quicker.
Right.
So good question, Sharon. So we have about 3 more minutes. Anybody else? Who's ever talking? I can't hear you. I'm sorry. Sounds like you're far away.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, Abby.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
You're connected to my Bluetooth so I could hear you throughout the whole thing and I forgot to turn it off. But okay, so I have I have a question as well, kind of like Sharon. I have clients that come in from the hospital with a diagnosis of borderline or bipolar, and they feel a lot of shame and guilt around that diagnosis. And as we talk more, it does seem like it's something more like complex trauma. And then they feel so angry towards the hospital and feel like the hospital caused them so much trauma. I have one client in particular that's struggling with this right now. Have you ever dealt with anything like that? And do you have any recommendations on like how to help?
Well, one of the things that I do is I will talk about complex trauma. I would say, you know, I know you got this diagnosis, but let's look at complex trauma. And I will even, one client, I sent the video to them about complex trauma, and it was like, yes, that's me. That's how I feel. And so even though they had that diagnosis, I gave them an alternative to look at. and let the client kind of settle with, okay, this seems like me, this doesn't seem like me. Because Abby, understandably, these diagnoses have a shame and guilt to them anyway, right? So when somebody get diagnosed with one of those two things, they feel like they are such a fractured person, right? Something's wrong, something's seriously wrong with them, and that they can't be fixed. Versus if you start giving them options of looking at how to see themselves different, they may come to the place like, oh, complex trauma, which has a different connotation to it, and they may find comfort in that. So that's what I tend to do. I give them alternatives to what maybe have been presented to them in a hospital setting. But yes, I do see the anger, because those things have a negative connotation to them. When you hear them talk about, the doctor talked about how like they throw around trauma, right? Everything is traumatic. So they do the same thing with BPD. They just throw that around. I'm sure your friends will say, oh, she's bipolar, he's bipolar. And they have no idea what that means. Oh, yeah. But they say that in a way to be negative. They're not saying and say, oh, she has bipolar. I think she has bipolar, so we should be more understanding. They say that as she has bipolar, she's nuts, something's wrong with her. So with the client, I usually re-educate. If I find that they do have a true diagnosis of that, I would re-educate them on the resilience, let them know that it do have some negative connotations, but that's from people who aren't familiar with, so they just easy to diagnose, right? And put people in a box. Or most of the time I show them to like that one on complex PTSD and PTSD. I send that to a lot of my clients, and they will say, oh, that sounds like me. And so that's how I tend to shift their view of from this hopeless shame and guilt.
Yeah, I love that. Rather than, explaining it too, but sending them a video so they have something. I really like that idea.
Right. They really love it. And all you got to do is cut and paste the clip into an email. If you type in the difference between Cptsd and post-traumatic stress disorder, that video that I showed will come up. And just cut and paste it and send it in an email. So I just want you to look at this, and I want you next week to tell me what your thoughts are. And I would say 80% will come in and say, that's me. Yeah. That is what's going on with me. And they feel a lot of relief. But there are some clients, I think that diagnosis is true. And what I do is work on resilience. I work on self-acceptance, and tell them and educate them that yes, the world may see this that way because they're uneducated, but you are educated, so you can see it for yourself different.
Right. Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Abby. All right, time is up. So what I want you to do now is review the video, The Paradox of Trauma-Informed Care. And as you review the video, I want you to write down things that resonate with you and why, including your thoughts, what it means to you. So we're gonna watch this video on The Paradox of Trauma-Informed Care. And I just wanna get an understanding of how you're starting to see it versus since we've gone through a little bit. So I just wanna see, check in with you and see where you are and see how this is trauma-informed care, if it's awakening anything, or if you still, kind of feel like I need a little bit more. So I want you to watch this, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
For over 30 years, it has been my privilege to work in a variety of human service organizations. And the common thread of that work has been about helping people heal from psychological trauma. And it's often been an uphill struggle, but not as you might imagine. It's not just about finding the techniques and interventions that help people heal, although that is a challenge. More often, it has been helping the larger systems in which we do our work appreciate the impact the trauma has on people's lives. So imagine my surprise in the last few years when trauma has now become so commonplace in our conversations and in media representations. So the field of human services is embarking on a new approach, an approach called trauma-informed care. In its most basic, simple way, it is a shift in the basic questions that we ask, a shift away from the question of what's wrong with you to a question of what happened to you. And more importantly, how does that continue to live on in your life and impact how you function today? So a trauma-informed approach would seem to call for greater sensitivity and a deepening of understanding. And therein is the paradox. Because quite frankly, as a society, we've been somewhat reluctant to come to terms with what trauma means. After all, the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, was not approved until 1980. Now, that was a really important milestone for us, but PTSD has always been a limited diagnosis. Limited because it was based on adults' experiences of trauma, adults who had the ability to describe to us what it was like to live with those intrusive memories of the traumatic event and live with their coping strategies, which were so much about avoiding any reminder of the trauma. But the reality is that after decades of research, only 25% of children, even those with corroborated histories of significant traumatic histories, ever meet the criteria for PTSD. Why? Because childhood trauma is so profoundly different. It happens in the crucible of those early critical relationships and can have devastating effect on a person's development. So we owe an incredible debt of gratitude to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and his colleagues who continue to tirelessly advocate for another additional diagnosis, the one that they now call the developmental trauma disorder. Now, that disorder has still not been formally approved, and yet it offers a very powerful framework for understanding how pervasive and persistent the impact of early trauma can be on a person's development, and not just on the child, but on the adolescent and the adult that they will become if we don't successfully resolve the traumatic reaction. So, what do I mean by human development? I'm going to go real simple here. In good human development, what we expect to see is that a person can reliably perceive the world in a fairly objective way and can problem solve and plan for the future in a flexible way. We expect to see that a person can recognize their feelings and tolerate them long enough to learn from them, and most importantly, learn to manage them. We expect that a person will be able to develop a stable sense of identity and a capacity for self-efficacy. And we expect that a person will be able to form trusting relationships and rely on those relationships for support and assistance when most needed. Now, all of those domains of human development depend on a healthy, well-regulated brain. Now, in healthy development, what we see by adulthood is that a person's thinking brain and their emotional brain can work well in tandem, so that when we experience stress or distress, the brain is able to cope and get us back to a steady state. This is the foundation of development, and this is the foundation that is so profoundly affected by childhood trauma. What we see in a traumatized brain are three really critical impacts. The first has to do with that emotional brain becoming literally a survival brain. Why? Because a child growing up in significant trauma has pervasive experiences of feeling fear, unsafe in the very relationships that are supposed to nurture them and guide them, unsafe in their bodies, and unsafe with their feelings, and ultimately even unsafe with their thoughts as they try to make sense of a chaotic and dangerous world. So what we see is an individual with a traumatized brain relies consistently on basic automatic survival responses: fight, flight, and freeze. Now, those can look very different in a child versus an adolescent versus an adult, but they become automatic responses that brain scientists now tell us literally hijack the thinking brain. So much so that one brain scientist called it a hostile takeover of the conscious mind by powerful negative emotions. Now think about that. The implications of that are profound because we have a core belief that people basically make good decisions or bad decisions. And I think what brain science is teaching us is that it's not that simple, that the traumatized brain cannot reliably access and use the thinking brain to make the kind of decisions that people need to make. The second implication that we see with the brain is that the alarm system in the brain becomes terribly distorted. Now, we all need an alarm system to register danger, right? But if the alarm system becomes so distorted that it perceives danger everywhere, danger in dangerous situations, and danger in neutral situations, and most tragically, in situations that most of us would consider good or positive situations. Think about what it is like to grow up with an alarm going off in your head all the time: danger, danger, danger. It is a profound interference in being able to be present and to make use of the resources and relationships around you. Now, the third profound impact we see in the traumatized brain is the ability to appraise the present and to learn from experience. Some have called this that the traumatized brain becomes like Velcro for bad and Teflon for good. Think about that. It's a pretty profound image, isn't it? I think that speaks to the power of those early experiences in literally wiring the brain. So these profound negative experiences are so powerful and weighty that the good experiences that happen later in life, while important and needed, just simply cannot easily unbalance the early experiences. And so what do we think about that? We often think that people can't heal, or that they're resistant to heal, or they're not amenable to our services, because we've built a behavioral health system and we espouse treatments that are more and more short-term. Developmental trauma cannot be healed in the short term. It takes time. Now, the sad reality too is that many of the people that most need our help are the most difficult to engage. And so it begs the question, do people with traumatized brains have to get better before we can help them? Makes us uncomfortable to contemplate that. And yet the answer might be yes, if we persist in holding on to our traditional toolboxes. But the answer should be a resounding no. Never have we known more about how to heal trauma after decades of research in trauma, attachment, and brain science. We don't know it all, but we've never had more information and more hope about what to do in helping access and calm brains so that they can then make use of the services that we already have. Now, some of you may be sitting there and thinking, wow, good luck with that, to those of us in the human service field. And clearly, we've got a lot of work to do. But my message today is bigger than that, because trauma affects us all. You have only to look at the work being done by the Center for Disease Control on the Adverse Childhood Event Study that show the profound effect of childhood trauma. Childhood trauma is demonstrated to be not only the most powerful predictor of the things you might guess, like anxiety, depression, substance abuse, and suicide. Childhood trauma is the single most powerful predictor of a host of chronic medical illnesses like cardiac disease. So much so that many researchers now say that childhood trauma is the single most profound public health crisis in our country. What do we do about that? Well, clearly in the human service field, we have our work, but we as a community have work to do too. I would ask you to think back to the core of childhood trauma. It happens in the crucible of those powerful relationships. So many people say the hurt happened in the relationship, and it takes new relationships to promote healing. The thing is, we can never predict which relationship might be the catalyst that sets a person on a path to healing. It might be a teacher, it might be a coach, it might be a neighbor, a cop, it might be any one of us. So I would ask you to take from this message the idea that we are all impacted by trauma. We are all paying the cost, whether personal or societal. We help people heal when we promote connection to one another and connection back into our communities. That's how we heal the future. So being trauma informed is something that we all have an interest in. Thank you.
So let's go to the activity. Remember, you were to view the video, write down things that resonated with you and why, including your thoughts, what it means to you. So of course, Dr. Dunham did the activity with you. And I'll start off because I thought about what Abby asked during the break. And she talked about, people coming out of the hospital with shame, guilt based off their diagnosis of borderline BPD. And what resonated for me, Abby, was we move from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And if we can talk about that in session with our clients, that is trauma-informed care. That's part of trauma-informed care, that we're shifting from a pathological place, right? What's wrong with you to an empathetic place of what happened to you. That's part of trauma-informed care. And that we are all impacted by trauma. That's another part of trauma-informed care, is that we all are connected to trauma, and that we have to realize that in order to help our clients from an overall place. So Abby, I thought about you when I was participating in the activity, and I hope that little tidbit you can take with you too to work with your clients. Anybody else?
Hey, Dr. Dunham, this is Alicia Murchison.
Yeah.
How you doing?
I'm well.
Don't know if you remember me from being my professor back in school, but my last name was Davis. Maiden name was Davis when I was in school. But in response to this exercise activity, the one thing that stood out for me is when she kind of briefly touched on the fact that working with trauma clients, can be the hardest to deal with. And just kind of touching on the fact that, it's not a short time. I mean, a short term, treatment is very much long term, but then obviously the different the therapies and things we have, that we are using a short term approach. But I started thinking about like certain clinicians who are within certain specialties and having certain niches that are enduring like vicarious trauma based on what they work with. And so I started thinking about like the burnout, the self-care, how to care for yourself, in a situation like that, because I see that all the time with other professionals who are not in the mental health profession, but that I kind of do some trauma-informed training for them. And I'm thinking like, wow, how does that impact us, as actual therapists and clinicians in the field? So that's something that kind of made me think about.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Guys, I just want to let you know that I see you're raising your hand, so I'm trying to catch it before I let somebody else. So we're going to let Chris Collins go and then Jennifer LaChance go. So let's go, Chris. What you got?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You absolutely don't want to look at me because I look like something that just crawled out of a hole. So I'm going to keep my name up there. I work as a clinical director, and we do a lot of work in CPS schools. And I guess this has come up for me, and it just keeps weighing on me, is the fact, and just, I guess I live in Chicago downtown, and I just think about the young people and violence, and the way we go about just making it all wrong. Now, I'm not saying it's right, obviously, but we don't step back to look at what's going on underneath there. And, you know, it's, yeah, I look at the fight or flight. And to me, it's like, it almost is overwhelming because I think about, okay, how do we go about getting down to the deepness of this and really being able to help our young people develop different skills, and how can we, you know, how can we really help? And so we're working with a lot of social emotional work to just try and catch our little ones before they grow up and try and help them heal before they get to even teenage years. And it just to me just needs to be such a bigger conversation and an understanding for people who are not in our field before we get so opinionated about everything, you know, being wrong. And again, I'm not saying the things and the violence that's happening is correct, but just being able to step back and say, wow, this is a society problem. It is affecting everybody. And how do we create a better system and understanding? So I guess those are the things that come up for me when I continually do this kind of work and think about how do I change my own way of working to be more inclusive of this work.
Yeah. Something you mentioned, Chris, about, you know, working with, I think you're hitting on that place of being, all of us being well-rounded. And so that's from the principal to the guidance, the school counselor, to the teachers, to the parents. And so one of the things I want to encourage all of you, if you can infuse attachment theory in your work with youth and kids, that sometimes really help them in the long term. If you can infuse attachment theory when you're working with you know, the vulnerable population. And I think that's a very important piece of trauma-informed care. We won't go into that today, but I think it's a very important piece of trauma-informed care. And realizing that, you know, most of us only have, on a good day, 8 sessions to make an impact. So, you know, really, you know, honing down on taking the meat of what we're being given and putting it out, you know, putting it out to our clients. So that's something that is, somebody has their mic on.
Sorry.
So that's the meat that we can kind of have that impact, is taking what we know in terms of trauma-informed care, because it can be so big, bring it down to a place where we can have the most impact. I'm gonna let Jennifer go, and then we're gonna move on, but those who have their hand raised, please participate at the next opportunity. So Jennifer, what you got?
Yeah, so I'm not a clinician. I'm a middle school teacher, and I'm working on my doctorate at GSU. And my topic at this point is trauma-informed care for adolescents with refugee experiences. And frankly, listening through the video, I had to do some deep breathing on my own just to cope with the things that my students are going through. So I'm a full-time middle school teacher. I teach English as a second language, and my students are mostly coming from Yemen. I also have some from Palestine and Syria. So they've been through war, they've had to flee. by boat to different locations out of fear for their lives. When they tell me about their previous school experiences, they're used to being beat at school. So some of that attachment theory that you're bringing up and how they might form a bond with a teacher is another issue. Most of the girls will be married off in arranged marriages and sent back to Yemen at age 15. So they're coming to me at 12, 13, 14 years old, knowing this is their only chance to learn some English and experience some school before further abuse will occur in their lives. So I'm wondering, like, I appreciated the talk of it. We're not talking about you're a bad kid, but what's happened to you. A lot of my colleagues don't understand the situation that our Arab kids have been through and see them as just behavior problems in the classroom. I'm also concerned about the language delay. They're learning how to speak English, but I think trauma impacts their language processing and how their ability to understand language and learn language as well. I do speak Arabic, and there's only a few of us in the school that do speak Arabic and can provide supports for them. So I'm wondering and thinking through, like, how do I support my colleagues and my students, and what little things can I do now with them? We don't have access to trauma-informed counseling. They're not in a position where they're in counseling or even know that they need a diagnosis. So that's just where I'm coming from. Thanks.
You know, Jennifer, that's awesome that you brought that up, especially when we talk about when you spoke on language delay and how the brain is impacted by trauma and their development. They are walking into a classroom with attachment injuries and trauma. So we got both of that going on. And we're saying, connect with me. And then we punish them because we think they're bad. We think they're difficult. Yeah, we think they're difficult. We think they're difficult.
Right.
So we heighten their trauma. We heighten their trauma. And I think that is like the basic thing, Jennifer, you could talk about with the other teachers is, hey, they come in with almost 2 strikes against them. We're asking them to cope with stuff. We're asking them to remember. We're asking them to change, lose their well, in some cases, lose their dialect to learn English. And how it's impacted their brain and development, but also is how we treat them in the classroom. If we are treating them like they've experienced, we're going to further create trauma, but also, get those delays in, being progressive in the classroom. And so that's the hard thing, I think, too, when I had a conversation with a teacher at a school board in Charlotte, and she was talking about all the teachers see Black boys bad, right? Black boys bad. And we talked about, okay, what area they come from and blah, 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 what kind of homes they come from, blah, blah, blah. And what I talked to them about is the impact of what they got going on impacts their development. And then you come in and treat them in some ways violently, you know what I mean? Or push them away and put them in this box of
We
being
make these
bad.
assumptions about who they
are.
are.
Right. And one teacher said to me, she says, you know what? I've learned that what she used to do is if there's a disruptive kid, she would take their desk. And you know what, Jennifer, this happened to me too. She would take their desk and separate them from the they had them separate, built out into 4s in a group.
Yeah.
She would take their desk and put them outside the 4. And I was like, can you imagine if that's what's going on at home already?
Yeah.
And she was like, I never thought of that. So it's those little things, Jennifer, you can educate them on and say, hey, are we making things better, or are we continuing what they've already been through? So that is part, Jennifer, of trauma-informed care.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for sharing. All right, let's go to our next one. So the key facts on trauma, the one that I want you to look at, well, I want you to look at all of them, but within a non-trauma informed approach, traumatic events are conceptualized as rare and discrete events that have predictable consequences for the trauma survivor. I really want you to think about that. And then an individual's perception of an event as threatening is a key determinant of his or her traumatization by the event. So, for example, if a woman is stopped on the street and threatened by a man who says he has a gun in his pocket, traumatization can result regardless of whether or not the man in fact has a gun. If the woman perceives her safety as under threat, that can be traumatic, right? So Jennifer, how would that look in the classroom? Wouldn't that, can you, if a child, perceives that they're going to get punished, how that impacts them if they have the perception of what's going to happen. So it is how the individual experiences the event that determines whether or not it is traumatic. And remember, trauma isn't because you stumped your toe, that's not traumatic. So non-trauma informed versus trauma informed approach. So what is the difference? So a non-trauma informed approach, the focus is on the survivors presenting symptoms, right? Rather than understand the context within those symptoms develop. So that goes back to when they said in the paradox of informed care, when she talked about what's wrong with you versus what happened to you, right? What happened to you. So the non-trauma informed approach has a tendency to view problematic behavior as symptomatic of some deeper pathology. So Jennifer, that goes back to your kids, right? So, some people would even erase that they're coming from war countries or they're fleeing for their life. They'll forget that and just believe deeper pathology, right?
Yep.
And so the non-trauma informed approach, the goal, is to reduce or eliminate the trauma survivor's symptoms. The focus is on simply eliminating the problematic behavior. So that's what they're doing in the classroom, Jennifer. That's what they're is trying to eliminate the problematic behavior, because we got things to do, right? We got to teach, we got to manage the class, so we got other things to do. And the underlying function of the behavior is often underlooked. So they're not looking, Jennifer, at what is the underlying function, what is going on with this kid, what has happened to them is being overlooked. So a trauma-informed approach is, So a trauma-informed approach is when a trauma-informed approach is utilized, symptoms are viewed as coping strategies, right? Coping strategies that the survivor adapts. And they understand that the symptoms likely arose within the context of trauma. So consequently, symptoms are understood to be creative attempts to cope with an overwhelming distress. These behaviors are seen as an attempt to cope with a situation in the context of a history of trauma, rather than being seen as symptoms of a larger underlying disturbance. So let me give you an example. When using the non-trauma informed approach, self-harm may be viewed as dysfunctional, right? Attention-seeking behavior. However, if you're using a trauma-informed approach, it is more likely to lead to an assessment of self-harm as an individual's attempt to self-regulate overwhelming affect. Because remember, they can't regulate emotions. Remember, they struggle with that. So you guys see that example when we look at, somebody who's self-harm from a non-trauma informed versus a trauma-informed approach. So sees them very different as, and I wonder if we were to approach eating disorders that way, is that it's not dysfunctional, but it's an attempt to regulate overwhelming emotions. A trauma-informed approach, the intention of trauma-informed care is not to treat the symptoms of issues related to sexual, physical, emotional abuse, or any other form of trauma, but rather to provide support services in a way that is accessible and appropriate to those who may have experienced trauma. So we're looking at it from a total different paradigm. And we also acknowledge the role of trauma may play in an individual's life, including service staff, right? We're also looking at it that way. And when I was looking at trauma-informed care, they even say from the person who's taking the intake over the phone, it's important to be trauma-informed. So the concept of complex PTSD, we look at the 7 dimensions of functioning that can affect by repeated trauma, affect regulation, what we've talked about, biological self-regulations, the disassociation, self-perception, perception of the perpetrator, our relations to others, and symptoms of meaning. I know that, really key in borderline personality is that relation to others, right? So difficulty trusting or feeling overwhelmed, dependent, or needy is often seen as borderline. So let's look at the survivor. So we're going to look at from the survivor from a non-trauma informed care versus a trauma informed care approach to working with survivors. So when we look at survivors and their mental health, more often than not, individuals with histories of trauma present with issues that are related to some current source of distress and not to their history of trauma. So this underscores the need for an understanding of the role and impact of history of trauma on the individual's current functioning, right? So in addition to understanding symptoms as adaptations, in a trauma-informed approach, the survivor's strength and resources are incorporated into understanding them as a survivor, right? So we're going to look at resilience again. We're going to look at who's around them to support them and help them. We would really encourage them to move outside of places that are going to be harming for them. We're going to encourage that transition, right? We're going to look at it as we're going to look at ourselves as a resource. So Jennifer, as a teacher, she's going to see her as a trauma-informed person, as a resource. So the people that she's working with right now are not trauma-informed, right? But when she comes in with a trauma-informed care, working with them, she's not going to put the kid out of the group of 4 because she can understand that being in that group of 4 can be what? A resource to help them, a resource to build relationships. So she will see that. And so this approach is essentially important in a crisis setting, as an empowerment model that focuses on skill building, skills and building on survivors, the strengths they may have, and ultimately support them through future challenges in life. So we want to look at the continuum, that continuum of, okay, we're not just, so Jennifer is going to try to do trauma-informed care, not just in the classroom, right? She's going to do it from the top down, and she's even going to look at the parents. I'm sorry, I'm using you, Jennifer, but that was a good example.
That's all right. Thank you.
So we are going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back. So we're going to take a 10-minute, and in the interim, I'll stay behind and answer questions. So I'm going to set my clock. So we'll come back at, what's that? 11, your time. Do I got it right?
Yep, 11 o'clock.
All right. Any questions? I know some people had their hands raised in the chat room that I may have missed. Is there anything that you want to ask? You guys, well, no, it's not time for you guys to be hungry yet. It's time for me to be hungry, but it's not time for you guys to be hungry. You got another hour to be hungry. So Jennifer, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Did some of that help a little bit to kind of conceptualize your purpose for working with this group?
It does, yeah. I think I want to look into a bit more of the attachment theory and just where, because part of their trauma has been through their teachers in the past. I mean, that's their primary traumas would be the war, would be fleeing violence. For some of them, it is also sexual assault that they deal with. But then how do they find someone who they see as safe?
Right.
Work through it. And I do have a couple of counselors at school that are really wonderful and are also working on some trauma-informed type things. They don't speak Arabic and they're not as knowledgeable about the culture, but they're asking me lots of good questions. That's really helpful. Yeah, it's just wondering what are some of my next steps as I journey on in this doctoral program and kind of get the information out to others.
Well, your doctoral work is the first step, because you're going to impact the profession and learning about trauma-informed care working with refugees. And so you're going to bring a different perspective that is different from what everybody else has been taught. Because, you know, let's be honest, Jennifer, how many of your faculty or your the people you work with, if the administration doesn't bring somebody in to educate them on something, they typically don't go to CEUs, do they?
No.
Yes.
And we're getting bombarded with so many other things that we're supposed to be doing that especially the needs of our English language learners gets kind of tossed to the bottom. So,
right. Yeah. And so one of the things is to really highlight how important that this will be beneficial in the long run. So if we want to see kids learn English quicker, if we want to see kids do better on tests, let's start here. Let's start there instead of, you know, discipline and, you know, focusing so hard on checking the boxes. So I'm just so glad you brought that example up. I thank you for that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The overlap between education and social services and what we do is just amazing. And I wish we had more time to collaborate together.
Yeah.
In the field. So
yeah.
Yeah. And then, I mean, the other part that I have to work through is I'm with these kiddos every day. And how do I, as an adult, cope with, you know, I haven't experienced the trauma myself, but I observe what's going on with them. I have compassion for them. I'm hearing their stories, and then I have to process that. Like when I get home from work, I have to go out for a walk and just, look at the sky and not, in order for me to process what I'm observing so that I don't get
Compassion
stay
fatigue.
healthy to
Yeah,
meet their needs the next day.
Yeah,
And that's just
compassion
wild.
fatigue. Compassion fatigue. Because
Mhm.
when you are fatigued, what happens is, or what could happen, Jennifer, is going into the classroom being disgruntled, not wanting to hear their stories, pushing them away because you're like, I just can't take it anymore, right? So it's really important for that self-care aspect for professionals. And I think school need to invest in retreats that's not focused on the agenda for next year.
Yeah. I mean, we're at a crisis point in our public schools. I mean, we can't get enough subs. We can't get enough teachers. People are just really burnt out, and really need to think through what we're doing as, I hope, administrators of schools, and just collaboration with social service in schools, so that we have teachers that want to stay in the field. Yeah, it's heavy.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Latrice, I think you had your hand up before you took it down. Come on out.
I did. I had my hand up earlier. And it was more of a comment about the video that we watched. One of the things that resonated with me was the same thing that you actually pointed out, what's wrong with you as opposed to what happened to you. Having a greater sensitivity and deeper understanding. So as I said, I'm a sexual assault advocate and domestic violence advocate, and I'm a master's student right now at GSU. And so my internship, I'm working with CETA and their youth program. So I work with District 215, which is the Thornton District area. And so I see these kids every day that are obviously experiencing trauma and not receiving any help. And that's not even what I'm there for. I'm there for a mentoring program, but I find myself incorporating trauma care with these kids, and it's heartbreaking. And then that was really stood out to me in a video, because they said that childhood trauma is one of the most profound health crises in our society. And it is. And it's something that I don't think is being addressed as much as it should. I go to conferences all the time. I'm always on these Zoom talks, and we're not discussing that. We just aren't. And then another thing that stood out to me in a video, when she talked about the traumatized brain. And so I see these children and they have traumatized brains. So how do we expect them to learn what they're supposed to be learning in school, to go on, get good jobs, go to college, become well-adjusted adults, and we're not dealing with their traumatized brains? And one of the things that she talked about, the three things that I included with the traumatized brain, and she was saying the emotional brain becomes a survival brain. So while these kids are trying to survive, how are they supposed to take in this information that they're learning in school? And then she also talked about the alarm system in the brain becomes terribly distorted. So some of the kids, and I see this daily with some of these kids, that the smallest thing causes them to freeze, or the fight, flight, or freeze aspect. And it's, again, it's overly sensitized because of the trauma that they've been through. And finally, the third one, she said, the ability to appraise the present. So the Velcro for the bad and the Teflon for the good. And so those things really resonated with me because I see it daily with these kids in high schools.
Absolutely, Latrice. I like what you said, that the expectation for them is to be well-adjusted adults, that no matter what they've been through, well-adjusted adults. And Latrice, when she talked about like trauma, we all are impacted by trauma, right? And if we look at our own trauma, because I would say, let's say, Latrice, and I would say, let's say 90% of us walk into the classroom or whatever we do with other people, we got our own trauma, right? But we tend to forget that how trauma impacts us. So then we don't see it as how trauma can impact somebody else. We are not if I'm not a well-adjusted adult, well, then how do I expect my third grader to be a well-adjusted adult if their trauma-informed approach is not in place. How do I expect that? But our society is expecting that. The Latrice, corporations are talking about it. Businesses are talking about it. Everybody's talking about how this generation is coming to employment and they don't have social skills. They don't have skills. They can't emotional regulate. They get really angry. I got a call from a lady who is mandated by her EAP, Employee Assistance Program, because she showed out at work. She like, you know, over in Latrice, I know this is gonna be, you know, you're gonna be like, wow. But you know what they fell out over? One employee gave the one employee was eating something like a big bag of popcorn, was eating a big bag of popcorn. And the other employee said, hey, can I have some? So the other employee said, sure, and gave her the whole bag and didn't just give her some. So she took the whole bag. And so middle part of the day, the other employee says, hey, I want my popcorn back. And the other employee said, oh, well, I ate it all. And that employee showed out, threatened to beat her up, was waiting in the parking lot after her over popcorn.
Dr. Donovan, that does not surprise me. I retired from the Postal Service after 25 years. I saw things just like that every day at work. We were recommending so many people on a daily basis to EAP. And it's because underlying things going on with them. Obviously, this was not just about the popcorn.
Right. And you know, thinking about, you know, her coming in and processing her inability to emotionally regulate because of the simple fact that somebody ate all her popcorn. Right. Where is that coming from? Right? Where is that coming from? And understanding that, you know, she is a survivor of something. She is a survivor of something. But it was amazing when they called me and it was like, yeah, she threatened to beat her up, threw keyboards on the floor, waited for her in the parking lot over a bag of popcorn. And I was just shocked. But, you know, we expect be a well-adjusted adult. Thanks, Latrice. All right, guys, let's come on back to it.
Hey, can I say something?
Patience. Yes, you've been having patience.
I just really appreciate this, but I noticed that even a client that I have, she's talking about childhood trauma, and everybody around her is telling her, since it was your mother, that's just your mother, you shouldn't have these, you should just pass over it. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about most of those clients they become adults and they carry that trauma. And she also is full of anger, and they're like, why are you so angry? You know, why can't you're making big things out of situations. Why are you getting angry? But I just want to comment, it comes into counseling as adults who who didn't pass through that childhood trauma. Right, or didn't get a chance to be in a position where they're hurt. What happened to you? You know? Right. So yeah, that's it comes into the counseling office.
Absolutely. And patience, going back to the lady, I call her my popcorn lady. You know, I started asking that question of more, what happened to you? And she has it was really interesting, Patience and Latrice. She had an experience where her body was never respected. Her body was never respected.
That makes so much sense.
So when the woman took her, she felt like I had no voice. She just made this decision without, you know, and so, you know, it made sense. It went to this place, right? It was a trigger. It went to this place of not being seen, not being heard. And also, Patience, I kind of found out that in her corporation, she's pretty high up in her corporation. Mm-hmm. And she says, I often feel like I have no control. If they say go do this, I got to do this. I have no, and no is not allowed for me.
Can you feel that pain?
Yeah.
It's raw. She's feeling that raw pain.
Yeah,
all the
that
time.
no she is not allowed to say no. She wasn't allowed to say no about her body as a child. And this person took her popcorn and just treated it like it was theirs. And she said that's how she felt in her body. Like the people who molested her treated her body like it was theirs, like they owned it.
Trauma over and over again.
Trauma over and over again. So she felt like it's so many places where her voice of no was never respected. So now we've gotten to that point of patience. We're working on that anger. We're working on that. I'm gonna quickly go. Somebody had their hand raised. Would you turn your speaker on real quick and say what you had to say?
Yeah, hi. My name is Abria, and I just had a thought while I'm taking in everyone's input, and then this session is really amazing. I just wanted to say something that, like, while I believe being trauma informed and having like a trauma informed therapeutic approach also means that you have to be culturally competent. And
yes, Abria, yes.
And this really came to me when Jennifer was speaking about her experience working with refugees and students that come from war-torn countries like Palestine, like Syria, and stuff like that. And I don't know.
Abria,
Yeah.
what about the ghetto in Chicago or
Right.
Boston or Detroit?
Yes, exactly. And I don't know, it just kind of clicked for me, because if you're not willing to understand, or if you're not willing to at least be aware or be sensitive to that cultural background, then you being trauma informed is not really helping the person you're trying to help.
Absolutely, Abria. Absolutely. So that is part of what you're talking about, Abria, is part of trauma-informed care. That's another layer. And we're going to talk a bit about multicultural, being informed multiculturally in terms of trauma-informed care. So our next slide is on, again, non-informed, but looking at the therapeutic relationship. What is the difference between non-trauma informed versus trauma informed care? So when we look at trauma informed services, we look at these relationships have the effect of taking power and agency away from the survivor. In addition, the expert entities and interventions aimed at managing the symptoms or providing stabilization. So that non-trauma, the position of the provider as the holder or the expert knowledge, and the survivor as the passive recipient of this knowledge. So going in there telling them, and that, you know what, who was talking about borderline? I can't remember, talking about being released from the hospital and anger and stuff like that. That is part of probably non-trauma informed, right? They take the position of the expert and not looking at the survivor as the passage of knowledge. And so when we look at trauma-informed approach, we see it as trauma survivors have often had power taken away from them in their relationship. So to counteract this, a trauma-informed approach, strives to work collaborative with the survivor, inviting them to participate in treatment planning, encouraging the empowerment of the individual. I know one thing that I do is before I write, even the EAP paperwork, I talk to my clients and say, hey, I know that I'm the supposedly expert, and EAP, your human resources, are expecting me to make the call here, but let's talk about this. Instead of saying anger, what is it that you want to work on? And she may say anger, but then we'll process it and come to find out it's complex PTSD, or it is tied to relationships. So trauma-informed approach will understand that, not take that expert stance. Also, the trauma-informed, ultimately the goal of developing a trauma-informed relationship is to facilitate growth and change, right? So as a clinician, we facilitate this by focusing on the strength of the survivor, and we kind of intervene in a way that increases the individual's knowledge, understanding, and their own skills. They're not dumb. You know, a lot of things take skill. This woman is high up in her position. She got skills to navigate, you know, to the place where she's making six figures. And if she's managed some things up to this place, and she has skills that we can rely on, add to our model to help her be a better, even better professional, that she won't get angry over popcorn, that she would learn that power of a voice, right?
Yeah, she's respected.
Yeah, and you know what, patients, taking the ownership of, I deserve to be respected, whether you think it or not, I deserve. And we talked about her being able to say inside herself, I deserve to be respected, but how it comes out. So we talked about that. So what does it look like when you say inside, I deserve to be respected? It's not beating somebody up over popcorn. It is saying to her, like, hey, I felt very disrespected. I was kind and wanting to share with you, but I feel like you just took it upon yourself to eat all the popcorn. And that's just not cool.
Right.
That is having power to say, no, that doesn't work here.
Right. With your words and not your actions.
Yes. And you know, but the part is key, patients, is that emotional regulation. If she could tap into, where is this anger coming from? What is this anger about?
Hey, right. Self-aware.
Right, self-aware. So we're gonna look at a video. We're not gonna look at a law, but it's by trauma-informed care role plays with Dr. Lori Markoff. And I just kind of want to get your opinion, some of you in the field, some of you in school, of what do you think? Because these are role plays, right? But she's supposed to be showing trauma-informed care. And I just want to know, you know, we're going to look at a couple of the role plays. I just want to know, what are you thinking in terms of, is this trauma-informed care? What is she missing?
Today, we'll look at trauma-informed ways to interact with clients. Lori Markoff will serve as counselor for the scenarios, and the clients will be played by actors. After they're finished, we'll review each one. Let's begin by looking at trauma-informed core competencies and how they affect how practitioners work with their clients. Using an empowerment approach is the first competency. It's important to remember the experience of trauma is one of helplessness. A focus on trauma-informed work supports the client in regaining a sense of control. With the empowerment approach, practitioners help the client identify the choices they have and walk them through the outcomes of those choices. Practitioners do not tell the client what to do. Instead, they offer as much choice and control as possible. It's also important to focus on strengths with this approach, not deficits. Trauma-informed practitioners help clients recognize strengths that have helped them to survive to this point in time. They also point out every choice a client makes that show their ability and capacity to achieve their goals. Knowledge is power, and practitioners educate clients about the relationship between past trauma and the current difficulties they're facing. Practitioners are transparent and make an effort to explain why they are doing what they do. When a client does not have control of the situation, it's important to provide information to help the client predict what is going to happen. Being able to predict is the next best thing to having control. It's critical for trauma-informed practitioners to build a safe relationship with their client. In most cases, clients have been victimized by people who claim to care about them. And because they've experienced few relationships that are equal, relationships without a winner or loser or perpetrator and victim, clients may not think it's possible to distinguish between safe and unsafe relationships. In fact, they may not even think relationships can be safe. When forming a safe relationship with a client, a collaborative approach is best. Practitioners should not position themselves as an expert. Instead, the client is the expert on their life experience, while the practitioner offers knowledge and experience. Together, they explore the client's life and consider the steps the client might take to move toward their goals. Asking questions can help establish this kind of relationship. Often clients feel providers do not listen to them. Practitioners should approach each person with an attitude of curiosity and openness. They should not make assumptions about a client's background, life, or past experiences. Being non-judgmental is important in building a safe relationship. Practitioners understand the choices the client makes are the best possible in the moment, and that the choice is about survival. Whether visible or not, it's important to remember the client carries a great deal of shame, and it's extremely important to be accepting without judgment. In gaining a client's trust, practitioners communicate as clearly as possible. Clients have experienced multiple betrayals and disappointments in the past, so providers need to go out of their way to be consistent between what they say and do. They also need to follow through on commitments and promises. Because clients feel they have not been seen, heard, or believed in the past, they often display extreme or difficult behaviors. Before discussing a behavior change, the practitioner validates feelings and checks out their understanding of the feelings with the client. This is part of building a safe relationship and also helps the client to develop their own emotional self-awareness. Practitioners are always aware of their own feelings, while also understanding the client's hypersensitivity to the response of others. The practitioner must use their own self-regulation skills and model these skills with the client. When understanding or explaining a client's current behavior, practitioners must realize that oftentimes the present behavior is an attempt to cope with past trauma or its impact. Instead of judging, the practitioner skillfully asks questions to increase understanding, helping the client to connect current behavior with adverse past events. This helps the client to see that current behaviors that appear to be self-defeating were developed as attempts to survive adverse events and their impact. Trauma-informed practitioners understand that when a person is in flight, fight, or freeze mode, the part of the brain that thinks may not be available. Therefore, a person in flight, fight, or freeze may find it difficult to make healthy choices for safety. Even if they know in their mind that the feelings are irrational, their body reacts as if there is imminent danger, and there is a strong urge to react immediately in a way that has protected the person in the past. The practitioner helps the client maintain their emotional arousal at a level where they can think. And eventually, the client's task is to learn to do this for themselves. Learning to modulate feelings and make choices by thinking requires several skills, like being aware of feelings, knowing when they are in fight or flight, and learning to pause until they are more calm, and then making a safe choice. A trauma-informed practitioner is aware of cues that a person is becoming dysregulated and helps the person to identify triggers that lead to this. Practitioners also help clients understand the strategies they can use to return to a more regulated state and can model them. These core competencies provide a solid foundation for a trauma-informed practitioner to build a strong, open, trusting relationship with their clients that supports growth.
So one of the things that we know is that sometimes people who have difficulty with anxiety and things like that have also had some bad experiences in their lives. So I'm going to ask you some questions about some of your difficult experiences that you may have had. And I'm just going to ask sort of yes or no questions. I only need sort of headlines. I don't need a lot of detail about the things that happened right now, but I'm just going to ask you those questions. And if anything about this interview starts to make you uncomfortable, you can take a break. If I ask a question you don't want to answer, you can just say pass and I'll just move on. So it's really up to you what you share, but I do want to ask you these questions. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So have you ever been physically hurt by anyone? Any, either as a child or an adult, you know, hit?
Yeah, I had a boyfriend a couple years ago, and he would hit me sometimes. But we're not together anymore. So.
Was there other kinds of physical abuse? You know, did he do more than hit you? Was there anything?
No, he would just slap me sometimes. Usually when he was like he'd have a really hard day at work, and maybe he would be drinking or something. He would slap me when he got home, but I got out of that, so that's good.
Well, it's good that you recognize that that was really not acceptable behavior, and that you didn't want that in your relationship. And it's great that you were able to get away from that. That's really good self-care, that you were able to make that decision and, you know, and make a different choice and create more safety for yourself. That's really good. Thanks. What about sexually? Has anybody ever, you know, when you were a child or as an adult, touched you against your will, anything like that?
Yeah. I don't really want to talk about it though, but yeah,
Okay.
when I was little.
How little? Just vaguely.
Like 10.
Okay. Okay, and was it a family member or a stranger or?
It was a family member, but I don't really like talking about it.
Okay, you don't have to. Okay, great. Thank you for telling me that much. That's really all I need for right now. Although it may be important for you to talk about that later at some point, you can wait until you're ready.
Okay.
Okay. As a child, sometimes parents aren't very available, don't provide basic food, clothing, shelter, that kind of thing. Did you ever have that experience of being neglected? What's going on, Trisha?
No, I don't like all these questions.
Yeah, it's starting to get uncomfortable, huh? You feel that somewhere in your body? Feeling that in your body? Yeah. Sometimes these questions can bring up very difficult things. I know. Sorry. When you're feeling like this, what helps you?
My cat.
Tell me about your cat.
She's a jerk.
She's a jerk?
Yeah. She's not very friendly. She's friendly to me though. When I'm really upset, she'll like cuddle with me on the bed and stuff. So she knows when I'm really upset, but
It's great that she knows.
yeah.
Pretty amazing.
She's just kind of a jerk. She'll bite and scratch at whoever she wants to, and she wants to be snuggled until she doesn't want to be snuggled.
What's her name?
Persephone.
That's a great name for a cat.
She came with it, and I decided to just leave it.
Wow, I like it a lot. Great. It's wonderful to have a cat named Persephone who's good at helping you when your feelings are difficult. That's really good. That's that's a blessing there. Can we go on with the interview now?
Yeah, I guess.
You're okay about continuing? Okay. I'm going to ask you some different questions. I want to ask you a little bit about your living situation. So, what kind of housing do you live in?
I have an apartment.
And how long have you lived there?
Almost a year.
It's not that long. And
No.
who do you live with?
Just the cat.
Just for a second. Okay. Do you feel safe where you live?
Safer than when I was homeless.
Safer, but maybe not entirely safe.
Yeah.
Yeah. What makes you not feel that safe where you live?
I have kind of a landlord situation.
Difficult relationship with your landlord.
You could say that.
Can you tell me about it?
Don't make a lot of money.
Olivia.
Hours got cut at work recently, and he said he was going to evict me, and I really didn't want to be homeless again. So he said if I had sex with him that I wouldn't have to pay my rent.
Wow. That's really hard. Makes sense. So you agreed to that?
I didn't want to be homeless again.
That's right. And in order to survive, anyone is going to do what they have to do, right? And it sounds like
that's what I keep telling myself.
But it's also upsetting you a lot.
I just keep thinking, like, what if somebody finds out? Well, now I told you, so obviously people are going to find out.
Well, what do you mean, people?
Well, I mean, don't you have to tell people when stuff like that happens?
No, actually, what you and I discuss is between us, and you'll get to decide what you want to do about that situation. So we can talk about it, but you get to decide. I only have to disclose if you're going to kill yourself or someone else, to somebody else. Those are, or if you're using an elder, those are the circumstances under which I have to let other people know. So this is something that's just for you and I to talk about. And as part of, our work together, we can decide what's the best way to take care of yourself going forward. So it's entirely up to you what we do from here. And I totally appreciate the courage it took to let me know that was happening. And I'm happy to be with you as you sort out what's really the best path for you going forward for your own well-being. We'll work on that together. Does that make sense to you?
Kind of. No one's ever said it to me like that before, so I thought you had to tell people, but
no,
if not, but
no. And I should tell you that. Remember how I said earlier in the interview that people who've had adverse experiences like sexual abuse in their past or physical abuse in their past, that sometimes that's connected to what happens going forward?
No.
Well, it's not. It's really common for girls who've experienced sexual abuse later in life to end up using or being in a position where they end up using that for survival purposes. So what you're experiencing is actually probably a lot more common than you think. But just like you didn't want to talk about it, you know, the reason you don't know that other people are doing that is because they don't often talk about it. So that way you think you're the only one in the world who ever ended up in this position, and, you know, but in reality, lots of girls who've experienced sexual abuse grow up, and it changes, you know, something that then, you know, they end up putting themselves, you know, they end up in situations. Now, obviously, you didn't create this situation, right? Your landlord is the one who is proposing to use his position of power to get you to do something that isn't what you want to do. And you're not responsible for his doing that. You're not. You're just doing what you've learned to do to help you survive. And we can work together for you to figure out what other options you have and what else you can do. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Good. Thanks. Willie.
So quickly, what are some of your thoughts? Thinking about, you know, how her approach is to trauma-informed therapy, is there anything that stood out to you, or, you know, that you would do different from a trauma-informed care?
I like how she encourages her to speak on it, but doesn't push her to like her limit, and like doesn't push her to the point where she'll feel overwhelmed in session, but at the same time letting her know that like she's present with her, and that like right now talking about it, she's safe. Like I really liked how Dr. Markef was doing that.
Okay, thank you, Abria. Anybody else?
I didn't like how, like when she said she was homeless, she didn't even address that. She just skipped right over that. I also didn't, so she started talking about, well, what happens to other people and how other people feel. I just felt like she should have concentrated more on her. And so I'm a veteran also. So I've been in therapy for years. I wouldn't want her to be my therapist. I didn't feel like she was very empathetic. I didn't feel like she really tried to get to the root of what the client was saying. I didn't.
Okay, thank you, Latrice. I want to go back to Abria real quick. You know, Abria, when at the beginning, one of the things that took me by surprise when I first watched that is the client said, I don't want to talk about it, but she kept going. The therapist said, she said it twice. And I think the second time she finally stopped, but she asked questions like, who was it? And she had already said, I don't want to talk about that. So a trauma-informed care I think it was the third time when she had started asking questions that she finally said something that was trauma-informed, where she was like, you know, you don't have to talk about this now, but we may address it in the future. It may be helpful. So that's where I saw the trauma-informed care. At first, I was a little worried. I was like, you know, you kind of pushing it here. The girl said, I don't want to talk about it.
Same.
But what'd you say, Latrice?
Same. I felt the same way.
Yeah. So, and also she asked her when she said she was sleeping with her landlord, she said, did you do it? I don't know if you guys caught that. She said, did you do it? And then she backtracked a little bit.
Right. I caught that.
Yeah.
I cringed.
Yeah. That right there could really make somebody feel judged. And that could also make somebody feel that that they're not understood, that they're doing what they're doing to survive. She eventually, from a trauma-informed care, did say, well, you're doing what you know to do to survive. So that was some of the things I want to show a little bit more and get your perspective. I just want to, okay, here it is.
I'm Lori, and I'm going to be your counselor while you're here.
Okay.
It's nice to meet you. I'm glad you're here. I heard you had a hard time last night. Do you want to tell me about it?
You know, they was eating dinner when I got there, so I went in to put my stuff up, and I guess they put the plates on the table and stuff, so I separated my stuff like I normally do on my plate, and then went back to put my stuff up, and by the time I came back, I swear somebody had messed with my food. I know they had, because it was like, jumbled up and stuff was touching, and I just, I was so upset. All I could think about was how I had to eat that dog food. So I didn't even want it. I just threw it in the trash.
So eating the dog food, that was a memory for you? It was something that happened to you before.
I had to do it.
Yeah. And that sounds really hard. What kinds of feelings did that bring up for you?
Oh, just sad. And like, it's just like I feel like an animal.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm sure that when it messes with your food, it reminds you of that. And those feelings are pretty hard, really hard. And so, how did you manage those feelings? What did you do?
Well, I tried to just, I didn't want to say nothing to nobody, because this is like my 6th group home. I don't even know how many they have here, but I like it here. I don't want to have to leave again. Mm-hmm. I want to make sure that I have a place to stay, but
you were worried about being kicked out. That's scary too. Yeah.
I had just got there, so I knew not to, I had just got there, so I didn't want to, I didn't want to start no trouble, so I had to do what I had to do.
So you felt like you had to handle this on your own, that it wasn't a good idea to let people help you.
Yeah, I'm not trusting people there. I just got there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I wasn't even paying attention. I just looked up when I got in the room. I still had the fork in my hand.
Mm-hmm.
So
you don't even remember making that decision. It just kind of,
just
there you were with the fork.
I had to do something, because I just wanted to just knock something over, just spit something over. I really wanted to put my hands on somebody, but
you felt pretty overwhelmed.
So
you actually like made the choice that this might be the safest thing you could do. Yeah. It felt like it was a better choice than you might hurt somebody, you might knock something over. So you actually thought about that, and I mean, that's pretty impressive. It's impressive that you were able to think of the things you didn't want to do and make a different choice. That's pretty impressive. That shows a lot of strength, really. So after you used the fork, did that help you? Did you feel better?
Well, yeah, a little bit. I mean, I didn't have to, I didn't still want to hurt somebody else. And, it kind of took my mind off of all that. And, so I could stay here. So I didn't just get up and leave again like I did the other places,
So all those overwhelming feelings, all those things you didn't want to do, you didn't want to hurt somebody, you didn't want to knock the furniture around,
right.
You didn't want to get up and leave. And so the alternative you could think of that would help you deal with the feelings was to use the fork to scratch yourself. Yeah, that's pretty amazing that you could make that choice, that you thought about what your best options were and you chose that. That shows a lot of strength. So are there any like negative things about using that, cutting yourself? What's the downside of that? Is there any downside?
Well, normally, like after it's over, a lot of times I have to, until they heal, I have to wear like long sleeves and stuff like that, because I don't want people asking me, what's that? What happened right there? All of that stuff. So I just, I just keep it bandaged up and
And, you know, try and just keep this covered, and it's kind of uncomfortable in the summertime because it's hot, you know, but.
Right, so you have to hide it. If somebody does notice and ask you about it, what's that feeling? What do you feel when somebody notices? You know?
I feel shame. And I don't know, sometimes embarrassed.
Why would you be embarrassed?
Because, you know, I know that everybody doesn't do that, you know what I mean? So, I mean, but, you know, it's been something all my life, but, you know, I see people with tattoos and braces and stuff like that, and they don't have all that stuff and scars and stuff on their arms. So, you know, sometimes I wonder, you know, how is that going to look, you know, later in life on my arms, or, you know, will I ever stop that? And, you know, how am I going to wear short sleeve shirts and, you know, when it heals up? I know I'm black, but
right.
So but it's not going to just like disappear. So
you don't really like having scars, and you don't really like people knowing that this is what you're doing. So those are the downsides. Those are the reasons why you might not really like doing this. And it sounds like you wonder if you're going to need to do it forever.
Yeah.
So first, I want to say again that it's amazing what you're able to tell me. I mean, I just want to tell you that not every kid I talk to can even say, I feel shame, can even name their feelings. So another thing, it seems like you're really aware of your feelings and you know how to name them. And it also sounds like you really think about what you do. So given all that, if we together could come up with other things you could do instead of cutting, maybe you would be willing to try them?
Yeah.
So have you ever successfully resisted an urge like that? Have you ever done anything else that worked? Ever in your life, even one time?
I mean, you know, when I do stuff to other people,
okay,
I don't do stuff to myself.
So hurting other people was another thing, but you've always either hurt someone else or hurt yourself in these kinds of situations as far as you can remember. So messing with your food, that's one trigger for you.
Oh, yes.
Do you know what the others are? Like, what are the other kinds of things that people might do that bring up really difficult feelings for you?
When people say mean stuff like, why do you look like that? Or, you know, why do you have that? Why you always got on long sleeves? You know, or they say like, why are you always wearing all those bracelets? Or, you know, or just when, you know, when they question me about stuff like that, and I really don't want them all in my business like that. It's just
so sometimes you feel a little like people are too much in your business, and that's another trigger. People being sort of, I don't know, pushing themselves into your business. That's another kind of trigger. So now we know two: messing with your food and getting in your business. So do you think that there's a connection between the bad things that have happened to you and your cutting? Do you think? So it's not uncommon actually for kids who've been hurt to end up finding ways to cope with the feelings of being hurt. And one pretty common way. So you're not the first person who said to me, I do this when I'm feeling overwhelmed and then it makes me feel better. Like, that's not an uncommon experience. And it's a particularly common thing for people who've been hurt when they were younger. That's a common kind of thing. And so you're not the only one. And how we like to work with people here is we want to help you learn what are the triggers for your urge to do that. So know what they are, just know them so that when it happens, you're not surprised. And then what we want to help you do is try other things before you cut. So try other things and see if they'll help you with those feelings, you know?
Okay, so I'm gonna stop it right there. And if I could just give me two people that haven't spoken about what their thoughts were about the video. Two people.
Hi, my name is Natasha.
Hi, Natasha.
So I think that she was definitely trying to use like a strength-based focus to really kind of highlight her elements of control in that and try to like raise her locus of control by like highlighting like what she could control in that situation through her decision making. But like at the same time, it was a little hard for me to hear. It almost felt kind of invalidating a lot. But like I could see like the technique that she was trying to use in that moment. And I don't know, it left me feeling a little weird after I watched like, it played out.
Natasha, is there one thing you would have done different?
You know, I'm not like 100% sure because, you know, like in the moment, it always feels different, like in the moment in conversation. And, you know, sitting outside of the conversation, I might be kind of like judgy. But like, I really would have tried to understand a little bit more of what was going on for that person. And I feel like she kind of glossed over that.
Okay, okay. Well, Natasha, I want you to, you know, think about it's not being judgy, more so as seeing what you could do different. So sometimes looking at these videos, it may highlight what you would do different and give you a different therapeutic view. So don't feel judgy. Don't feel judgy. Anybody else?
I have a question. Was this the first session with the young lady?
You know, Shakira, I hope I'm saying your name wrong. They don't indicate. So you can choose what you think.
I don't know, because they taught us in school like to always address the elephant in the room. So the young lady is African American and the clinician is white. So I guess I would have, if I was her doctor, I forgot her name, I just would have asked her like, how do you feel working with someone who looks like me? You have any concerns? Like that's how I would have started the session off with. And there are some things I would have done differently. Like personally, like I don't think I would see her methods are, I don't know how to like phrase it. I just felt like she's not meeting her, like I don't think she's
meeting the clients where they are.
Yes, there we go. Thank you. Thank you. And I feel like she like glossed over some things that I would have just like kind of just let the client like take more control over. And she asked a lot of questions and it just didn't feel like super comfortable. Like I don't know if I would feel comfortable like seeing her if I was the client, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So Shakira, let's go, because I'm glad you brought up culture. Let's go to if this even was the third session or the first session. I think you're dead on by, you know, I would have said, you know, some of the things that we're going to talk about in here are going to be really tough. And me being, you know, tough may be about trauma, things that have happened to you in your past, things that are happening now that maybe you feel guilt or shame about. Me being a white or Caucasian counselor and you being an African-American female, does that pose any problem for you? Would that keep you from being able to share your story with me? What do you think about that, Shakira?
I love that. Like that's something that I would have definitely done, and that would have made me more comfortable if I was the client. I was like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, because we don't know if her hesitance, even in the first session or the third session, if it shift because she's like, oh, I'm talking to a white woman.
Right.
And so you have to address it anytime you think that the shift could be related to race.
Right. Yeah, they taught us that in school. Like,
yeah,
at first, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable, but you like have to do those things.
Right.
And then after you go, you just kind of go from there, and but you want them to feel safe and you want them to be able to trust you. So I would just like, even if the roles were reversed, like if the clinician was, African American and the client was, like, how do you feel? Like,
right.
like be very truthful, honest. Like, I always let the clients know, like, if you hurt my feelings, like, don't worry about my feelings. Like,
right.
Your session,
Right.
Thank
Absolutely, Shakira. Absolutely. So some of the things I think that I would have done different from a trauma-informed care, not saying Dr. Metcalf was wrong, but just me, what I would have done different is spot on, Shakira. I would have brought that up. I would, when she said, how she handled things on her own, I would have asked after, have you had to do this, handle things on your own? Have you had to do this, previously or whatever in the past, handle things on your own? I would have asked that question, and then I would have connected it to her cutting and then to triggers. I would have asked what is behind the triggers. I would have not asked her, but I would have investigate what's behind the triggers. And look at, I would have done something Dr. Metcalf did, is look at what she's done alternatively to cutting. So I would have asked that question. But I do think Metcalf tries to give unconditional positive regard. So that's what my thoughts were on the video. So now we're going to look at the cost of trauma-informed care. If you guys need to take a break and get something to eat, go ahead and do that and come on back. Just don't stay too long because I don't want you to miss anything. But, we only have an hour and about 5 minutes. So I want to cover, we don't even have that long. Yeah, we do. Yeah, okay. So what is the cost of trauma-informed care? So we look at the risks included unnecessary hospitalization. We also want to look at not the best diagnosis for the client, inadvertently traumatizing, and inability to make appropriate referrals. So Simon's 1975 said a second injury can result when a survivor's primary trauma is exacerbated by an insensitive helper's response. So some of the things that you may see with Metcalf can, possibly, especially with the first one, when she said she didn't want to talk about it, that could have been viewed as insensitive. It is important to inquire about trauma and leads to, it's important to remember that inquiring about trauma can lead to recognizing trauma, and recognizing trauma is an important first step in providing trauma-informed care. I'm gonna skip this discussion. So next, we're gonna look at treatment improvement protocol. So here we want you to look at the fundamental concepts of behavioral health services providers can do. So become trauma aware. right? Understanding from a bigger perspective and not just the individual. Evaluate and initiate use of appropriate trauma-related screenings and assessment, because there are some out there. Implement interventions from a collaborative, strength-based approach. Learn the core principles, that reflect trauma-informed care. Anticipate the need for specific trauma-informed treatment. So you want to look at your planning strategies that support the individual's recovery. And then you want to decrease re-traumatization, evaluate and build a trauma-informed organization and workforce. So like I said before, trauma-informed care comes from the person that meets them at the door, to the intake person, to the therapist. Even when the therapist is thinking about referral, it's a process, and you have to keep that in mind. So what does trauma matter? Why does trauma matter in behavioral health services? So the rationale is it stresses the importance of addressing the client individually rather than applying general treatment approaches. So you have to be versed in several, I would say at least 2 approaches that would be beneficial, and that those approaches marry well together, so you can incorporate stop interventions from one from the other. And then the trauma-informed care provides clients with more opportunities to engage in services, okay, that reflect a compassionate perspective of their presenting problems. And then trauma-informed care can potentially provide a greater sense of safety for clients. So especially those who have history of trauma. So there's 3 trauma-informed approaches that when you look at incorporating them, you want to look at these 3 elements. Realizing the prevalence of trauma, recognizing how trauma affects all individuals, and recognize and putting your knowledge into practice. So when you leave this training, I'm hoping that you will take at least 2 things that you will use for yourself, but you will educate somebody else on how to do. So I'm really hoping Jennifer, will take something from this and say, hey guys, this is what we need to look at different. If anything, just to see our population different. So the view of trauma in the context of individuals. So there are many factors that contribute to a person's response to trauma, whether it's the individual, group, community-based trauma, individual attributes, developmental factors, including protective and risk factors like history, type of trauma, specific characteristics of trauma, amount and length of trauma exposure, cultural meaning to traumatic events, number of offenses associated with trauma, available resources, internal and external, such as coping skills and family support. And the community reactions are a few of the determinants that influence a person's response to trauma across time. So here's some of the things that I want you to think about when you're understanding the levels within the social ecological model of trauma and its effects. So you look at the individual factors. So this is where you will use that psychosocial, okay? Mental health status, temperament. Then there are interpersonal factors such as family, peer. How are they doing with those? Their history of trauma, their social network. Community and organizational factors, their neighborhood quality, school system, faith-based settings, transportation availability. Then societal factors such as laws, state and federal economic and social policies, media, social, societal norms, and the judicial system. Because, like, from a societal perspective, if the world thinks this is not important, then you will think it's not important, and then therefore not address your trauma, right? So the overall societal norms is, oh, when you're getting ready to have sex and you say no and he keeps going, that's not rape, right? If that societal norms believe that, then you will treat that trauma differently. You may not report it. You may live with a lot of shame and guilt because you're like, you know, I feel like that shouldn't have happened, but the world say that, you know, I had gave permission first and I can't take it back. So those are some of the things from a societal factor. Then we look at cultural and developmental factors, collaborative or individualistic cultural norms, and then period of time in history, societal attitudes related to military service members, the things that they're going through, and understand the changes in the DSM-5. So some of the things I want to leave you with as advice to counselors and administration, and you want to send the right message. And this message is, as a counselor, therapist, treatment provider, you cannot consistently predict what may or may not be upsetting or re-traumatizing to clients. So therefore, is it important to maintain vigilance and an attitude of curiosity with clients, inquiring about their concerns that they experience or that express, or presenting treatment. So you want to remember that certain behaviors or emotional expressions can reflect what has happened to them in the past. So you want to look at both the client and providers can competently manage traumatic experience and reactions. You want to ensure them that recovery is possible. And one way to do that is tap into their already resilience. They're resilient because they've come to you. Even they're like, well, I can't work, I can't get out of bed. Well, you took a shower to come here, or you got in the car to come here. That says a lot about your ability and that recovery is possible because despite what has happened, you came here. So so first and foremost, a trauma-informed approach begins with taking practical steps to re-examine treatment strategies, program procedures, and organizational policies that can solicit distress or mirror common characteristics of traumatic experience, such as loss of control, being trapped, or feeling disempowered. Remember the woman with the popcorn? She felt disempowered, not only in her own personal life as a child, but in her professional life as well. So to better anticipate the interplay between various treatment elements and the more individual aspects of a particular client's trauma, some of the things you can do is work with the client to learn the cues, obtain a good history, maintain a supportive, empathetic, and collaborative relationship. Remember, collaborative is that you let them be a part of the treatment process, right? You don't push them. You wait and go at their level. Then you encourage ongoing dialogue, and you provide a clear message of availability and accessibility throughout treatment. In sum, I want to summarize with trauma-informed providers anticipate and respond to potential practices that may be perceived or experienced as re-traumatizing to clients. So you're able to forge new ways to respond to specific situations that trigger a trauma-related response. And they can provide clients with alternative ways of engaging in a particular problematic element of treatment. So those are the things you want to remember. So create a safe environment. It is not new to us to create a safe environment, but it's an agency-wide effort, okay? It's an agency-wide effort. Remember I told you, from the person that welcomes them in, the assessment, the therapist, and if you need to do referrals, right? Creating a safe environment within a trauma-informed framework far exceeds the standard expectations, okay? So you look at everything: emergency management, disaster planning, adherence to client rights. Providers must be responsive and adapt the environment to establish and support clients' sense of physical and emotional safety. So honest and compassionate communication. And remember that equally important that safety extends beyond the client. And beyond anticipating the various emotional stimuli within a program, you may want to generate strong emotions and reactions to the trauma survivors, such as triggers, seating arrangements, emotional within a group, or visual or auditory stimuli, right? So those are some of the things that you want to keep in mind. And then including peer support specialists. A lot of agencies aren't really financially able to do this. But, you know, one thing you can do, those who have private practices, including peer support specialists, is like, say, for instance, one internship agency that I have is that their interns have to do 3 semesters. The first semesters they learn, they start the learning process of peer support. And then they serve as like peer support specialists from those for trauma victims. So they spend about a year with the clients, right? So that's one way of if an agent's like, oh, I really would like to do peer supports, have peer support specialists. One of the things you can do is train interns, but I suggest that you have interns that's going to be there for at least 3 semesters to do peer supports, to serve as a peer support specialist. And then support, control, and choice and autonomy. So for some individuals, gaining a sense of control and empowerment, and along with understanding traumatic stress reactions, may be it's not maybe, it's very important for recovery. So by creating opportunities for empowerment, counselors and other behavioral health service providers help reinforce clients' sense of competence. So it helps them feel like they can not overcome, but go through this process. Keep in mind that treatment strategies and procedures that prioritize client choice and control, it doesn't need to focus solely on major life decisions or treatment planning. You actually can apply such approaches to common tasks and everyday interaction between the staff and the clients. So, you know, here's some of the things that you want to try to ask your clients, which are a sample of the types of questions you can be useful. So in creating a collaborative relationship and participation opportunities. So trauma-informed principle, it has 3 main tenets. Ensure that the provider client relationship is collaborative, regardless of setting of services. So here's what you will run in against is, like, say for instance, you go into a place that's not well trauma informed and they say, well, this is the model we follow. It is up to you ethically to learn how to infuse, just like it's important for you to infuse multiculturalism. It's important for you to infuse trauma-informed care ethically, because of the simple fact that it is part of care. and we want to provide the best possible care and do no harm. So when you are working with an agency that has this already laid out plan, you have to look at how can you infuse this. So when they talk about regardless of setting or service, you have to look at how to incorporate trauma-informed care. So it's a collaborative relationship, okay? Then you want to emphasize the need to ensure client consumer representation, so client counselor representation and participation. You know, you want to look at planning, evaluation, as well as the professional development of behavioral health workers. So you want to familiarize the client with trauma-informed services. Okay, so what does this mean? It involves explaining the value and type of trauma-related questions that may be asked during the intake process, educating clients about trauma to help them normalize traumatic stress reactions. So like, you know, providing a video or, you know, providing some, I don't like to do a lot of statistic talk, but some psychoeducation, all right? And let them know this is, you know, this to normalize it so they don't feel like they're the only ones. Then you want to look at discussing trauma-specific interventions and other available services, okay? And when you, here's what I think every counselor should do. So we all have our own models of counseling, models or theories of counseling. So what I do is I give my clients a sheet that says, this is my model, this is what I practice, right? And in that, I will discuss with them when they come to session, I will incorporate trauma-informed care, okay? I will incorporate that. And part of telling them the model that I use is trauma-informed, because they have that right to understand it and to refuse if that's not going to work for them. So I have clients who actually don't really want to talk about their trauma. They just want coping strategies. They're like, look, that happened to me a long time ago. I don't want to revisit that. All I want to do is learn how to get along better with Johnny. And even though in my head, I'm like, well, in order to learn how to, you know, get along better with Johnny, we got to do some of this other work. And some clients are flat out like, I don't want to do that other work. I just want you to tell me some coping strategy and some steps. Do this, do this, do this, right? So then I would tell them, I'm not the therapist for you, because we can't work collaborative if what their needs are or what they're willing to do is kind of not congruent. So we're typically not going to work together. I would tell them, I said, well, here's my model. This is how I kind of approach counseling. And this is not where you want to go. And I want to be supportive to what you want to do. And based off my model, I wouldn't be doing that. I will be forcing you to go to a place that's not what you're looking for. And then I will refer them most likely to somebody who specializes in CBT or short-term therapies, solution focus and stuff like that. So so you want to use developmentally appropriate psychoeducation about trauma-informed service, allows the client to be informed. So you want to inform them all the way through, right? From the front to the end. So incorporate a universal routine screenings of trauma. So screening should guide treatment planning, right? Knowledge about screening and scoring is really important. Sometimes you will find an instrument, somebody's mic is on. Sometimes you will find an instrument that's really cool and you like. this is the thing I want you to remember. You don't use assessments that are for fun, meaning that they're not going to give you any information that's going to be helpful to the client. So you want to use as much as possible empirically validated screenings and assessments, because there's a lot of articles that help you with that you can read after you screen them, that you can read to add to your model, that'll help you be successful in working with clients. And then you want everybody to learn how to give screenings, but consistent, that you all want to be, giving it the same way as possible. And this is a view of the trauma through a social cultural lens. So cross-cutting factors of culture. So, you want to look at religion, language, geographic location. So let me tell you why that's important. I'm a Southern girl, right? So I'm different than the Midwest. Most of you who've had me for class know I always say I'm a Southern girl. I'm from the South. That means something. So always remember, when they say I'm from the Midwest, you want to ask, what does that mean? How does that shape you, right? You want to look at family and kinship, gender roles and sexuality, gender roles, gender norms, attitudes towards sexuality and sexual identity and sexual oppression is important. And then cultural identity, a degree of acculturation. So those are some of the things you want to think about. So when we look at how culture influences trauma, so culture determines acceptable responses to trauma and shapes the expression of distress, right? It significantly influences how people convey traumatic stress through behavior, emotions, and thinking immediately following a trauma and well after the traumatic experience has ended. So traumatic stress symptoms vary according to the type of trauma within culture. Culture affects what qualifies as legitimate health concerns and which symptoms warrant help. In addition to shaping beliefs about acceptable forms of help seeking, behavior, and healing practices, culture can provide a source of strength, unique coping strategies, and specific resources, okay? So some populations and cultures are more likely than others to experience a traumatic event or a specific type of trauma, okay? Culture influences not only whether certain events are perceived as traumatic, but also how an individual interprets and assigns meaning to trauma. So how can the use of strengths-focused perspective promote resilience? So this is part of helping the client. So fostering individual strength is a key step to prevention when working with people who have been exposed to trauma, right? It is also an essential intervention strategy. So one that builds on the individual's existing resources and views him or her as a resourceful and resilient survivor. So I will tell my client, wow, man, most people or some people would not be able to make it through that, but you did. How are you able to do that? Oftentimes that answer to that question is something you will pull on. Like if they say, oh, it was my faith, oh, it was my brother, or it was whatever. You will use that in the future to promote resilience and to continue to encourage them. So individuals who have experienced trauma develop many strategies and or behaviors to adapt to, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual and, psychological consequences. So some behaviors may be effective across time, where others may eventually produce difficulties and disrupt the healing process, okay? So, we got a couple of minutes, so I want you, many of you who've had me for 8859 at Governor State, who have taken my family course, we do something called reframe. And what we want to do is I want to give you this activity to reframe the client's presenting problems and challenges, okay? So the definition of reframe is actually a family counseling and therapy technique that assigns a new meaning to a presenting problem to facilitate change. So there's no correct reframe, except for I want to give you this. There's no correct reframe, but you want to reframe it in a positive or a resilient or a restraint base. So you want to do that, okay? And you need to remember that it must be tailored to fit the belief system of the particular family. So we're going to do, I'll say, do the presenting problem, and then you're going to reframe it, give it an alternative reality. So I want you to do depression. So I want you, the presenting problem is depression, and I want you to reframe it. And then I want you to reframe adolescent running away. And then I want you to reframe disrespectful teenager. So only reframe those: the depression, adolescent running away, and disrespectful teenager. I just want you to reframe those three. So I'll give you, let's say, 5 minutes. So remember, you're thinking from positive, strength, and resilience. We have 4 more minutes. So you're just doing depression, adolescent running away, and disrespectful teenager. I did it. 3 more minutes. One more minute. And you can write as many as you want for each one. All right, let's start. Who wants to do depression? Who wants to give an example of a reframe for depression?
I'll do it.
Jennifer, yay. Come on, Jennifer.
I said taking time to regroup or be revived or recover.
Okay, okay, great. Anybody else want to do depression?
I would.
Go ahead, Patience.
Legitimate response to deep pain and difficult circumstances.
Excellent, Patience. Very good. Anybody else?
Can I give it a try?
Yeah, Sharon, come on.
So I like to reframe it in terms of what our 100% is, right? When we're dealing with depression, our 100% looks a whole lot different than it does when we're having a great day. So just getting out of bed that day, right, to sit and talk to me takes 150% effort. And so I look at it in terms of effort to say, hey, you may not feel like you're doing a lot because it's so difficult for you, but it takes a lot more courage and resilience to do it on a day when we're dealing with depression, or at a time when we're dealing with depression, than it does when we're having a great day and nothing's going wrong.
That's good.
Okay.
That's good. That's good.
So some of the things you could say is an understandable response to a difficult situation. Depression is a coping mechanism to an overwhelming situation. Ooh, sorry. Who has the adolescent running away? Who wants to do that one? The adolescent running away. That was a hard one for you guys? Okay. So something you can say, oh, who wanted to go? Who is it?
Natasha.
Okay, Natasha, what you got?
But a search for stability and peace in an attempt to find a safe space the best way they know how.
Yes, good job, Natasha. Anybody else want to do one on adolescent running away?
I can. Mine was actually pretty similar to Natasha's. Just trying to find a way to find time for themselves in the only way they know how.
Oh, good. Anybody else want to do adolescent running away?
What about what a courageous attempt to create boundaries as to what you will and won't accept?
Okay, good. Good job. I compliment you. This is a very creative way to achieve autonomy. You are trying not to be a burden so the family doesn't have to take care of you. Disrespectful teenager. Oops, sorry. Anyone got one for disrespectful teenager?
I have asserting your sense of independence and to be heard. That's the development where you're developing your independence.
Okay, good patient. Shantae, what you got?
Hey, Dr. Dunham.
Hi.
I was going to say like asserting yourself and then strengthening your voice or using your voice.
Oh, see, you remember from my class, don't you?
Yes.
Oh, good job, Shantae. Good job.
Hey, Shantae.
So it's kind of similar to what you guys wrote. So you're telling your folks that you want to grow up and be more responsible for yourself. You keep the focus on you instead of others' problems. Okay, so I think we got a little bit of time because I only have a couple more slides left. So we'll be ending right on time. So I want you to think about this. It's a strength questions. So I want you to create some strength questions. And strength-based is a resilient minded approach. It lets trauma survivors begin to acknowledge and appreciate their fortitude and the behaviors that have helped them survive. So it is important for us to engage in interventions that use a balanced approach that targets the strengths clients have, helping clients who have experienced trauma connect the dots between current problems, past trauma, when appropriate. So I want you to give me one strength question. Give me one strength question. What can we come up with? I'm gonna give you 3 minutes. Just one strength question. Two more minutes. One more minute. All right. Who would like to go? Give me a strength-oriented question.
It can be anything.
Yeah.
So I thought of what is something in your life that makes you feel strong?
Okay. What is it something in your life that makes you feel strong? Good job, Shakira.
This is Alicia. I was gonna say, what can you do to show or give yourself grace?
Oh, good question, Alicia. Especially, Alicia, if you have a spiritual person, that's a great question to ask, especially dealing with trauma and they're dealing with guilt and shame. Excellent question. Who else?
How about a time where you felt like you contributed to a situation or felt satisfied with your contribution?
Oh, I like that second part. When you felt satisfied with your contribution. Good job. Is it Josie?
Yes.
Oh, thanks, Josie. Anybody else?
What
Carla,
have you tried that is working well for you?
what have you tried that is working well for you? Good. Anybody else?
I had to add one more. What can you do to take better care of yourself? Because that usually gives them, you know, like a chance to take a better insight into what's been going on and how they can improve it on their own, like use their strength and their coping skills to figure out how they can improve.
So Alicia, ask that question again.
What can you do to take better care of self?
Okay, so if I'm your client, I would assume that you're saying I'm not taking good care of myself.
Mm-hmm.
So reframe it for me.
Tell me the things that you do to take care of yourself.
Yeah, tell me some of the things you do to take care of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Or what are the things that you like to do to take care of yourself?
Yeah. Assuming that they do. Okay, I follow you.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? One more.
Hi, I'd like to go.
I have one.
Terry, hey Terry.
Hey, I always ask clients, what do you do to honor yourself?
I love that. What do you do to honor yourself? What do you do to honor yourself? And we had somebody chime in, but I got to Terry first. Who come back and tell me what?
That was me. Me is Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
I guess mine would be when you felt the best or when you felt your best, what were you practicing or what tools were you using to feel that way?
When you felt your best. Okay, I got it. So here's some of the things is potential strength-oriented question. What are some of the accomplishments that give you the most pride? What would you say are your strengths? How do you manage your stress today? Some of these questions I would do a positive interlude, like, wow, you look great. What is so different about you today that you're managing your stress? What coping tools have you learned from your fill in the blank? How do you gain support today? What does recovery look like for you? One of the things you can do, a strength-oriented, is to say the miracle question. I know many of you in counseling and social work and therapy know the miracle question. So we're going to talk a little bit about vicarious and secondary trauma. And yep, I got the time. So secondary trauma is a normal occupational hazard for us, especially substance abuse professionals, the research says. It's something that happens to us that serve populations, and it's the effects from providing services focused on trauma or listening to clients recount traumatic experiences. When a counselor has a history of personal trauma, working with trauma survivors can evoke memories for the client's own trauma history. And it also may increase the potential for secondary traumatization. So we're going to look at a quick little clip.
Let's play a little game. We'll play a word association game. I'll say a word and you can picture something in your head. You can even shout it out loud. Are you ready? Cow. Okay, so most of you maybe were thinking this. Maybe a few of you were thinking more this. And maybe some of you thought this. We'll do another one. Work. Awesome. So some of you really love your work like this. Maybe a few of you were thinking this. And I wonder if anyone felt this. We'll do just one more. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. So most of you thought this. Maybe a few of you were thinking this. But I wonder if anyone thought this. Compassion fatigue is the post-traumatic stress disorder related symptom that you receive vicariously as a secondary target to trauma. Compassion fatigue is experienced by those in a helping profession. Doctors, nurses, counselors, therapists, police officers, and maybe even you. If your unpaid role is that of a helping professional, then you may also be affected by compassion fatigue. If you are the middle of the night phone answerer or helping a friend through addiction or anxiety, if you are raising children or caring for parents, or maybe both at the same time, if your unpaid role is that of a helping profession, compassion fatigue could be affecting you as well. Now, what puts you at a greater risk for compassion fatigue is empathy. Those generally in a helping profession have a very strong empathetic response system. And empathy is that ability to pick yourself up and put yourself in someone else's shoes and get it, really get where they're coming from. The problem with empathy is you don't get to decide when to jump out. And those traumas that they experience begin to change you. I remember when I was the supervisor of a therapeutic group home, and I was sitting down with one of my clients. She began to tell me the horrific and painful stories of her past. And as she laid out in detail what she had experienced, my cell phone began to vibrate. And I wanted to show her that I was listening and I cared about every word she said. So I picked it up and I silenced it and I put it back down and I continued to listen. From that day forward, every single time I picked up my cell phone, swiped to silence it, I was transported back to her trauma. My brain had created a PTSD related symptom that transported me back to her situation every single time for years. Now, this would be pretty normal if it happened that day after work at the grocery store, or maybe even a week or 2 weeks later. But where we get concerned that maybe this trauma is starting to change you is when it's sticking around for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and maybe even longer. Now, for many years, compassion fatigue was confused. People called everything burnout until Dr. Charles Figley came around in the late 80s and 90s and began to do research. We called it burnout. But the truth is there's a significant difference between burnout and compassion fatigue. Burnout has to do with being worn out, and tired, and just flat out not liking your job anymore. Compassion fatigue has to do with being afraid. Compassion fatigue begins to change your hardwiring, change who you are. We see this a lot in child protective service workers. They start to become overly vigilant, believing that everyone is out to hurt them and their family. When I think of this, I can't help but think of the nurse who came after one of my classes and said, still to this day, she can see the broken bones of the young man who was abused by his parents. That still today, she knows the smell of death from a patient who laid in bed dying. These memories, they do not just go away, and they begin to change you. But we like to make excuses because we think we're superhuman. So we say things like, I'm fine. I'm a professional. I can deal with the stress. In fact, it doesn't even stress me out. My famous talk off was, I've been doing this for 15 years. I know most people think it's stressful, but I'm okay. The problem with that is when stress and trauma start to affect you, your brain and your body, they do not pull for your opinion. And they will start to show signs and symptoms because your body and your brain are shouting at you, I am not okay. I cannot handle the trauma. In little ways, whether you start to have sleep problems, either you're sleeping all the time or not able to sleep at all. Another way it manifests is becoming a workaholic. Now, I know plenty of you in this room think, Amy, there's nothing wrong with being a workaholic. Get off my toes. Let me tell you why it may be a problem. Because when we start to feel like we are losing control of the world around us, what we do is we roll up our sleeves and we work a little harder. And I can work hard enough to make this trauma go away. Another sign and symptom is feeling unappreciated and under-resourced, like what you have is not enough to get the job done. Now, I'm not saying that's not true. There's a very good chance you are indeed underappreciated. But when you started in this helping profession, or when you started helping your friend or your family member, did you know you were going to be underappreciated, but you said, it's okay. I want to do this anyway. It's okay. I love you enough. But then somewhere along the way, that is no longer okay with me. It is no longer okay that I am not thanked and that I don't have what I need to succeed. What that tells me is your circumstances, they didn't change. You did. Maybe you changed because of life. Maybe you changed because of maturity, but maybe you changed because of compassion fatigue. And the last symptom I want to talk with you about today is called self-entitlement. And self-entitlement is a justification of negative maladaptive behaviors because of the positive things you do. The best way I can picture putting this is most of us went to school and got a degree or a certification to be professionals at what we do. But the truth is, I'll let you in on a secret, that's not enough because we're overachievers. So we require little invisible badges to really be professionals. Let me tell you what these invisible badges look like. For social workers, I know it looks like this. I stayed up all night long helping Joe Smith at the hospital. Now I'm a real social worker. For some healthcare professionals, I know it looks like this. I worked 2 shifts in a row. Now I'm a real healthcare professional. Where this turns into self-entitlement is when it looks like this. I stayed up all night helping Joe Smith at the hospital. That's why I'm a little cranky today and biting everyone's heads off. I worked 2 shifts in a row. In fact, I worked 60 hours this week. So I'm getting wasted all weekend. We begin to justify the negative behaviors because of the positive things that we do. Now that I have thoroughly depressed you, I want to give you some good news. That compassion fatigue can be identified, arrested, and treated at any time. That you can begin this journey for post-traumatic growth. That you can be better after trauma than you ever were before. And the best way I can think of putting this is when you think of an airplane, you know that the stewardess tells you where those exits are, and then they begin to tell you to please put your mask on you first before assisting other people. Now, every time I travel for vacation with my family, I show the stewardess that I'm listening. I get the cue card out of the backseat pocket and I give eye contact. I'm almost the only person on the plane listening. And I show if the plane went down, I could save the plane. I'm real intense about it. And yet it never fails. Every time they finish, they come over to me and they say, excuse me, if there were a change in cabin pressure, what would you do? And I'm a little offended. I don't know why they asked me that. But you see, that flight attendant, they see something you don't. They see the carry-ons that I travel with. They see this. They do see me, and they see this. You see, that flight attendant knows that no matter how much I listen to her, that I will put their masks on them first before caring for myself. But you see, she also knows that no matter how much of a super mom I believe I am, that I cannot live without oxygen. And yet every single day we do the same thing. I put your mask on you, and your mask on you, and your mask on you. And I don't care for myself. But you see, we can only give what we have. We give out of who we are. And if I don't care for myself, I certainly cannot care for you. So I'm going to ask you to complete a piece of homework for me. And I'm going to ask that you please do this every single day for the rest of your life. I have big expectations. I'm going to ask that you take 10 minutes just for you. 10 minutes to put your mask on you first. 10 minutes to pray or meditate, to exercise or take a walk. But 10 minutes to care for you first. Take 10.
So I want to ask you, because we have about 9 minutes left, what are some practical things you can do for self-care, being that you are now trauma-informed, for vicarious and secondary trauma? What are some of the things you have done or you suggest people do?
I'll go. I meditate every day. I start my day off in bed. Before I get out the bed, just do a quick meditation. Sometimes it's 5 minutes, sometimes it's 10 minutes. I practice yoga. I pray, and I like to journal.
So Shakira, how does those things help you with self-care?
So the meditation part, so when I have lots of anxiety, so the meditation helps keep those anxious thoughts, whether or not like controlling me all day. I'm not thinking like, oh, why did I say that? So I use that time to just say, all right, it happened. I can't take it back. And it keeps me calm and less anxious. The yoga part, it just really helps me like de-stress. Like, let's just say I had a rough day on Monday, or I don't know, something is bothering me. Like I forget about that rough day, like during that yoga class. And then like right after, I feel like a brand new person, and I'm ready to sleep really great that night. The journaling, it allows me to get everything out. So if I'm feeling like really sad or angry, like I just write it all down. And then I'll play some songs to help me cry. And then usually after a good hour, I'm good. But it, and I see a therapist. So that helps a lot too.
Yes, and I'm glad
That's good. That's good.
I'm glad you're doing all those things, Shakira, but most importantly, I'm glad that you see the benefit of a therapist.
Yes. Oh.
Yes. They are I see a therapist, because, not only our personal life, but like she was talking about, it's the hearing of people's story all day in, day out. Most therapists who are full-time see about 30 clients a week.
Ooh.
That's a lot, seeing 30 clients a week. And social workers see even more. So Brittany, what you got for me?
I was gonna say that the most trauma-informed self-care that I do is see a therapist of my own. So
Absolutely, absolutely. And how has that been beneficial to you?
just like by allowing me to not hold it all in on my own and just process it with someone else. And just kind of, work through the feelings that I'm holding
Right,
of my clients.
right. Absolutely. Thanks for sharing.
Mhm.
We got Alicia.
Yes, I'm here. So you can tell me if this one is a good thing or a bad thing. I kind of been struggling with it, but what I've adapted to do for my self-care is not answer my phone. I do not make myself accessible for a lot of family and friends, because over time I learned that once people learn what I do, they just start dumping, and it started to kind of shift my relationships. Friends will start, it's like you're seeing me in that helping profession capacity, and I want to just be a friend. When I'm not working, I'm not working, and I want to be my human, regular self. And I noticed that sometimes people can't handle that when you start implementing that boundary. So I stopped answering my phones. Because like you said, I'm seeing clients through the week, and when I'm off or when I have my downtime, I don't want to spend my time having certain conversations that make me feel like I'm in therapy with a friend, or having to do therapy with a friend. And so it's been helpful to me because it doesn't interrupt my workflow or my day, and it allows me to let people know when I have space and time to deal with that. And if I do not, I don't, and I don't worry about it. And at first I was starting to wonder, is that a bad thing? But I actually think it's very helpful for me. Some people are starting to get it, and I do see a little shift there. So that's just definitely something that works for me, not having everybody to be accessible to me, even in clinical private practice as well. Maintaining
Yes.
boundaries.
Alicia, did you not see me? Did you not see me clapping when you
Yes.
said that? Okay. All right.
Boundaries, boundaries.
Yes.
It is so important for us as mental health professionals to have boundaries. And you know what, Alicia? I learned that after I have my students that after those who know me, that after 1 o'clock on Friday, I do not respond to any email until Monday. And what I've done is at night, I do not have my ringer on or vibrate or anything. So I can just veg out. I want to watch Love and Hip Hop. I want to watch somebody else be crazy, So I don't want to be in that place of helping all the time. So I get it. So good job doing that.
Definitely.
Olivia.
Hello. All of this universality here with having a therapist, identifying my feelings, you seeing 30 people, overwhelming. So to aid myself in the trauma-informed care, it's not just having the therapist, but I also got a mentor, because of the need for me to have someone who identifies similarly to me as a Black woman in a professional setting in healthcare. I consult. And so I have coworkers and colleagues that we chat. This is a shared experience. We're seeing all these people, and sometimes supervision, we need more.
Absolutely.
So,
Olivia, I love that you say mentor. I love that. It's so important.
It is. And I also had to be resilient, because it's not always easy to get a yes when you ask for a mentor.
Yes, yes. But mentorship, you know what I find is fun about mentorship, Olivia, is it's a little different than therapists in the sense of they have no connection to what we do. So mentorship could be spiritual mentorship, or not necessarily mentorship in the sense of our profession, but you can have mentorships of life.
Life coaching.
Yeah, life coaching. Absolutely. Thanks, Olivia. We got time for one more, and that's C. Holmes. Who's C. Holmes? C. Holmes. CHOLMES. Okay, well, she's left us. Who else want to go? We got one more.
I'll go. This is Latrice.
Hi,
So,
Latrice.
hey, so as I told you guys earlier, I'm a veteran. So I participate in a veteran support group. And so we have a therapist that leads our groups. And so that's really a form of self-care for me, going to a group therapy.
Awesome. And you know what? It'll be really cool if therapists could get together and create groups where they do readings and they just process life. But if anything comes up, you all are therapists.
Absolutely.
Yeah, group therapy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's a cool thing too. So I just want to say, everybody, thanks for sharing. You guys were so in participation. I loved it. And I hope you got a lot about trauma-informed care and you learned something, especially about complex PTSD. And I will see you again in the future. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. It was so
Thank
good.
you, Dr. Dunham. Yes.
Thank you.
So good.
Thanks. It was great to see you again, Shay.
I know.
You too, Terry.
Thank you. It was so great.
Thank you, Shakira.
Thanks, Dr. Dunham.
You're welcome, Carla.
Yeah, because it was off
This
the
was
chain
wonderful.
good.
This was
Yes.
really good.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the time, Dr. Dunham.
You're welcome. I enjoy it. I've always loved doing stuff for GSU. That's my heart and home.
Well, I finally feel like
What'd you say, Sharon?
I finally feel like I'm no longer cheated. I didn't have an opportunity to have you as a professor. So I have felt cheated for these last 2 years. This is great. I really enjoyed you.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. All right, guys, go ahead and log off and have a good rest of your day.
All right, you as well. Bye.
It was very nice to meet you, Dr. Dunham. I've heard so many good things about you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yes, you're welcome. I will compress this into a YouTube video and share it with all the folks that came and also folks that were not able to make it.
Okay.
Thank you so much. This was very informative. I learned a lot as a beginning counseling
cool.
I was able to pick up a lot of things. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. And would I get a copy too?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm going to end the meeting now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.